do you think that the Democrats kind of screwed themselves over? What would you say to someone that's really worried? Like if they're also gay and they worry, or maybe they're a woman and they worry about abortion or whatever. Like what do you say to the people that are really scared of the upcoming administration?
I think that's an important question to ask. I'll admit, I mean, oh, yeah, I've been gaming since I was 5. I competed in Super Smash Brothers for several years. Um, and right now I'm pretty into action games and some RPGs. Uh, as far as being an intellectual, I have been curious and thinking about a lot of big subjects for a long time, as far as politics is concerned, and also the way that people interpret reality and make sense of it. That's something that has fascinated me for almost a decade at this point. And then, yeah, I love my friends. I love spending time with my relationships. And finally, on the co-entrepreneur part of it, for the last year and a half, I've been working with a woman who I really enjoy, Megan, who started her own marketing agency several years ago, and I've been basically her number two for the past year and a half, and it's been wonderful. Um, been living the entrepreneurial life, and it's great. I can't recommend it enough for ambitious people who want to wield their own destiny.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember Jordan Peterson of all people saying something, and this was like from years ago. Who he was on Steven Crowder, and he mentioned to Steven that statistically, liberal people tend to be a lot more entrepreneurial, which was surprising to both him and me. Steven kind of fought back on that, and I was surprised to hear that. But in retrospect, it's not all that surprising. Maybe it has to do with like people conformity, having a tendency to conformity. They'll just kind of get used to what they go through the system, and people get more creative. Creativity is probably rewarded in an entrepreneurial field.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to, if you're betting on yourself, that you're going to be able to chart your own successful path, it's because you think that you are going to be able to do something that other people aren't already currently able to do. And I think definitionally that means you have to be creative to some extent, to be able to sort of chart a strategic vision and see a niche for you to be able to fill. And yeah, I think that you're probably going to see that more with folks that are a bit more temperamentally liberal. I didn't realize that you were familiar with sort of Jordan Peterson's work. I think pre-pandemic and all of that, when he was still on the benzos, I think he offered a lot of really great stuff. I would defend him in that period. A lot of his work. I wouldn't defend him after he got off the benzos and post-COVID, but it's just been an old crank. I was actually thinking about this earlier in case that he did come up because I think he explains a lot of ontological dispositions about people with his research on Big Five trait theory. But yeah, I think he's like an interesting case as to what would have happened if maybe Friedrich Nietzsche didn't die so tragically early. Maybe he would have went crazy and we wouldn't have had nearly as
Mhm.
much of him. Because that certainly feels like what Peterson has done to his own legacy, but tragically.
Yeah, I actually do agree with you. I'm familiar with a lot of the people within that scene. So basically, anyone that's talked to Peterson, I probably heard of and am pretty familiar with. And I agree with you. Like, I think that he had a lot of insight into like, what he spoke on about psychology seemed to resonate with me. That a lot of that made sense. And there's a lot of insightful lessons he has, I think. But when he talked about politics, it was already always like it always felt a little bit like conservative leaning, like no matter what. And it just became it was like a nosedive towards conservatism when the pandemic happened and after he got off his medication and got out of rehab, like you said. It's really I agree. He was doing a tour this past year and he happened to be nearby one of my cities. I was so tempted to go there and get like the VIP ticket so I can shake his hand and tell him that I appreciate some of what he used to say, but I think he's like a quack now. And I really do want to say that. I wouldn't say quack, but I would tell him something in a way like, listen, you don't have to be like this. Like, let's have a conversation. But I worry that even if I did something like that, even if I had a bigger name and I was more recognizable, I worry that it wouldn't make much difference to someone like him. It's kind of like too far gone. What do you think of that? Do you think people that are already kind of towards that era or that side of the spectrum are too far gone, or do you think there's hope to reel them back?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting question because I think it depends a little bit on circumstance. I did read a quote sometime in the last month or two, and it was like it's really hard to convince a man of something when his salary depends on him not understanding that. And I really think that that actually encapsulates a lot of the dynamic for Peterson, in that, yeah, he's not a professor anymore. And without that income, I mean, he really has just decided to go hog wild on this sort of right wing online grifting culture warrior sort of thing. And he's just sort of let a lot of this dribble come out because it's gotten him a lot of clicks. And I think what's so disappointing about all of it is that I thought he was a good faith conservative
Hmm.
before all of this, and I thought he was actually a role model for conservative intellectualism
Hmm.
and for people to sort of, you don't have to go the way of the Donald Trumps or the sort of evolutions that even Ben Shapiro like figures have taken in circa before 2020 and all that. It's obviously gotten worse since then. You can still actually say no. Let's live in reality and not appeal to emotion and conspiracy first and foremost. And actually, yeah, it's important. I mean, this is why functioning democracies need a good faith conservative party and a good faith liberal party, because both parties will have ideas that need pushback, that need criticism, so that we can have lively debate and get to better solutions, and not swing too far one way and have blind spots. And so he was, to me, I felt like he was a really good force for sort of both philosophically as well as just even temperamentally pushing people in that direction of wanting to not be sort of a barbarian, but really to strive for being a polite person in society who could sort of bridge that kind of divide. And then he just, after the whole thing, getting off the bench, that just all went away. And you almost don't even hear him speak about it anymore. And yeah, I have thought about it too. Like, but I've also obviously, like you said, there was a tour and you could have maybe seen him in person, because certainly over social media, no one gives a damn about what anyone is saying to them on Twitter anymore,
Yeah.
whether you have a blue check or not. Now that that means nothing, other than that you paid Elon Musk some money. And yeah, I feel like maybe in person, but this is how he makes his livelihood. And so I don't think cognitive dissonance sucks, but like obviously big successful people have found a way to swallow it and move forward. So I don't know if there's unfortunately anything that would save him of that until maybe in his later years and he kind of the pressure falls off. Maybe he would reflect on it. I don't know.
Well, you're right to say that he was kind of this extra, like this alternative voice to a sense of conservatism, where it was like, here's someone that is eloquently explaining philosophical conundrums from what seems like through a transit, like a through what seems like a conservative filter or lens, but not in a really toxic way. Not all the time, anyway. There are still some moments where I'd be like, I still disagree with you, but you know what? We can, at least I agree with everything else, so I can kind of find some nuance in the conversation. And
He was good faith.
yeah, he was good faith. And even there's that moment I've seen of him, like, where he was, in his mind, protecting traditional fundamental Christians, or people like that, of faith like that, who wouldn't want to like produce a cake for a gay wedding. And the interview asked a question like, well, what if they didn't, like, denied a black person a cake for their wedding because they just believed that their religion protected only their race or whatever? And he would say like, well, like he actually in that moment thought silently for a second and went like, oh, maybe that would be wrong. And then he's like, well, what's different about like the gay example? And he's like, maybe it's not. He's like, maybe I was wrong about that. Like he said that right then and there, and like that does show some good faith stuff. But this was pre Daily Wire Jordan Peterson. But I guess the good thing is, like, or a good indicator of that he probably was good faith, and I agree with you, is even now he's still anti, like, Andrew Tate and the red pill kind of movement. He still is outspoken against that. To be fair, even Ben Shapiro is, so that doesn't really say all that much. But a lot of conservatives seem to either just be pro Andrew Tate or turn a blind eye to all of the blatantly obvious illegal activity that he engaged in. um,
Yeah. I mean, the bar is pretty low there, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so it's neither here nor there. So, but we like obviously this is a good chemistry, so we can dive really deep into like pretty much any of these topics. But I want to not get too ahead of ourselves. Like, if it's okay with you,
For
like
sure.
to talk a little bit more about kind of you and like how you got to this point in your life and why you're thinking about this sort of thing. You explained that you're now like going through an entrepreneurial path and you're working with somebody with their agency, and that's been really good for you. That's awesome. Um, you said that you actually let me back up a second. So you and I met through streaming, but I actually don't remember the first time that you and I interacted ever. Um, I guess I should ask a question like, why the name Cereza? Does it have any significance, or is it just kind of like a fun name because you like the video game?
So you were actually, I don't know, I think it was closer to like 2 years ago at this point. Maybe not
Oh,
fully 2 years ago, but you were
well,
just finishing your Bayo 2 stream, and I popped in there.
oh,
And because at the time I was sort of interested in like, oh, when people play Bayonetta, like, as someone who's been a huge fan for the last 8 years and played it on and off, um, I was like, I like tuning into people to see how they would play it and all that. And so I didn't get to see your gameplay at all, but you seem to have really enjoyed it from the sort of after game experience that you were chatting about. And yeah, I was like, wow, this guy seems pretty cool. I like the whole Yoshi Island theme that you had going on, and I was like, wow, he's got like a strong brand identity as a Twitch streamer, and he's got fun charisma and everything. So I followed, and then I tuned into a couple of your streams over between then and a few months ago, when we sort of interacted again more thoroughly, and yeah, then you had that stream, and we were talking about what your goals and your ambitions were when it came to this, and all those conversations just sort of got us like, oh wow, I think this would be a great conversation to have on the podcast and whatnot. And so here we are. But yeah, as to the name Cereza, so well, look, it's been 15 years since the original Bayonetta, but yeah, Cereza is actually Bayonetta's name. She when she wakes up after 500 years of being asleep in the first game, and she has these sort of ribbons through her hair that in demonic read Bayonetta, and so she went by that name for 20 years before the events of that story where she sort of regains her memories and realizes who she actually is.
hmm
For me, her whole story, I only knew Bayo 1 and 2 at the time, but it really resonated deeply with me and my own personal story and journey. Being a different person, being homosexual, and having to
hmm
sort of learn what that was like. Obviously, it's a different era now, but 8 years ago was only a year after Obergefell v. Hodge and the legalization of gay marriage. And so culturally, we're in a much different place. I
hmm
mean, I talk to younger LGBT Gen Z folks, and I, I think on some level, almost at this point, they take for granted how much more accepting society is in their high
hmm
school experience. And obviously, that still varies. There are some high schools that are less accepting, but yeah, it's kind of like I'm happy that they don't have the same struggles uh, forced upon by society that I had. But for me, it was very formative, and so her story and journey really resonated and aligned with mine. And I needed a tag when I was competing in Smash, and I was like, I love this character. I'm playing her in this, and she really fits me. And so that's just been my gamer tag ever since. And 3 in Origins has not disappointed. It's further aligned
Nice.
me with the character. So I definitely, it's, people have their soul characters that not just like a phase. This is it for me. She's there for the whole ride. No, she's great. So I could go on about that in great detail, but I don't want to spoil the whole
Yeah, well, that's
franchise.
good. That's
So
good news because I love the first two games. So the third one I haven't played yet. That's good that you gave it a good review.
oh,
Um,
absolutely.
it's interesting that you related to Bayonetta so much as like does being homosexual like is that like a big contributor to relating to her so much somehow?
Yeah, I mean, being so for her, her parents, her mother was a witch, as she is an Umber
Mm,
witch, and her father was a Lumen Sage, but that was sort of taboo. That you were not to have relations between the clans, and so she grew up sort of as this outcast amongst the outcast. She was a witch, but not even the witches liked her because she broke the tenant. And so she felt alienated. And she also didn't have access to her mother or her father growing up much because the father was banished from the clan and she never really saw him. And her mother was imprisoned and she did see her sometimes. And so she had to really raise herself. Um, I have supportive, especially economically speaking, parents, but I don't feel like they've ever really fully understood me. And um, so that sort of childhood scenario really resonated with me. But then also just sort of trying to uh, go through this journey of figuring out who am I, what am I here for, and how am I going to deal with all the challenges that are going my way. That really resonated with me, especially post acceptance. I accepted myself after repressing myself for 8 years, my identity for 8 years. At the very end of high school, it was 2 days before my AP calculus exam, and yeah, so fresh out of high school, it was like I had a lot of work to sort of do because if you don't actually accept yourself and you sort of delude yourself, which I think is gonna this is an interesting segue to some of our further conversations about my like sort of epistemic journey. Um, if you don't live in reality, you really can't actually push yourself forward as an individual. It sort of stagnates you. And yeah, I was learning a lot in school and developing in other ways, but like as a person, I mean, I was stunted. And so part of college was really catching up and then trying to get ahead towards the end. And I did that and it was great. I loved those years. But yeah, I feel like she sort of has that arc, especially in the first game. And in the second game, um, things are going her way. Tomorrow is mine, as the
Yeah.
thing alludes
What a
to,
what a
and
great
she's
choice of song.
yeah, oh yeah, and she's winning, and she's doing things and feeling confident and saving her friends, helping her people that she cares about out, and that was sort of me once I really had a firm feeling about who I was and the kinds of connections and relationships that I was making, and so, but yeah, I mean, she just the fact of the matter though is that like the allegory between homosexuality and being a witch in this case and a taboo one at that
Hmm.
is just that you had yourself to figure everything else out for yourself and how you were going to comport yourself in the world and who you could trust and what mattered and what didn't matter because obviously people feel the way that they do about you and you can't control that and it's unfair. It doesn't matter, right? But like for people who aren't arrogant or narcissistic to an extreme degree, that's the challenging sort of conclusion to accept because we obviously want to be a part of society. But if you want to push yourself forward, you have to. And so, and she just went through a lot of adversity, and that's why she's one hell of a tough cookie. And for me, I'm really grateful about my story because that adversity formed who I was. But yeah, it is her journey. For those reasons, it really resonates with mine because there are a lot of surprising parallels, and it's I'm forever grateful for Hideki Kamiya and his work. If I could just express, there's not enough money for me to express my gratitude.
I bet. Well, I remember I that it's interesting to see you like correlate um it's interesting to see how you relate to her because like as you're explaining it, the more that like stuff is clicking in my head of how you might. And I'm curious like I also do like the games. I'm not probably as familiar with the lore as you are just because I haven't like I didn't I'm not I don't think I'm as big of a fan as you are. Although I am a fan. I'm just like I love the games. That's actually why my cat's name is Lumen. He's based off it comes from the Lumen Sages.
Oh
Um,
wow, that's
yeah,
cool.
that's why because my sister has a black cat whose name's Salem, which I think is from the TV show, but obviously the Salem witch trials. So I kind of wanted to have like a contrast of like a biblical name or like an angelic one. So originally it was going to be like one of the highest ranking angel names, like Ophanim or whatever they might be called. A throne
Yeah,
is another name for one of the highest ranks.
and the
But
Seraphim. Yeah,
but
yeah.
my Hispanic side of the family had was impossible for them to pronounce it. And then I thought like Lumen Sage is kind of was like the opposite of like the Umbran witches, right? There's the Salem witch trials, and you have like a Lumen Sage, so that rolls off their tongue a lot easier. So I also like Bayonetta, as you can see. I named my son,
That's so cool.
but and something else about Bayonetta was like or Cereza is that she was born of a Lumen Sage and an Umbran Witch, right? Is that how that happened? Like they came
Yes.
together, and that's where Cereza came. So there was always this kind of like an outcast from the moment you're born, something that she had no control over. They kind of blamed her for, like she's not one of us because of the circumstances of her birth. Which reminds me a lot of like a homosexual struggle. There's people to this day that are trying to convince people that you can just convert right over. I just saw a couple of videos recently about conversion therapy, like classes that people are buying for their kids to this day. Um, do you have any experience with something like that? Do you know anyone personally who's had a harder time? You don't have to talk about anything like that if you don't want to, of course. But first of all, actually, I should ask, like, do you relate to Cereza in that way as well? And also, do you have any personal experiences with being oppressed or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things about it is like she sort of turns the tables as she's like fighting angels
Yes.
in the first game. Like she uses these torture devices that were used against witches in the Inquisition and the witch hunts
Oh my
throughout
gosh, you're
Europe.
so right. It's so deep.
Yeah, she uses it against them, and I loved that because it was just like this idea of no, I'm not taking your shit, I'm throwing it back in your face. And uh, for me, fortunately, no, I haven't had to deal with it probably nearly as badly as some other people. My father and I, there was a moment when I was growing up, and he thought maybe I needed to go to counseling, and it was like no, and we just sort of no, 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 all that kind of obfuscation and pushed him off the edge. But other than that, I've had two times that I was running outside or walking down the street or something, and someone yelled the F slur out the window. Other than that, though, fortunately, I really haven't. Yeah, I think some people were uncomfortable around me in high school because of it,
Mm,
which I think spoke more about their own fragility around their own sexuality
yeah.
than anything else. But it's just for me, a lot of my experience was about just the ambient nature of growing up in a society that doesn't accept you, like having to be careful about how you express yourself, how you comport yourself. Um, for me, I joke with a lot of people because I feel like straddle this sort of perceptual fence, if you will, and that there's some people who are mostly okay with it, they'll like know immediately. Like I had one friend who said on the first syllable I wondered it, and then on the second syllable out of your mouth I confirmed it. Which I can't control that at all. And then I've had other people though, particularly older people who maybe are okay with it or not. They would never know, and I guess I have to shout out and thank all the beta males out there that play great cover for for people like me because oh well they're straight obviously, right? So
Yeah.
uh, I'm not saying that I'm a beta male, but like it's just
Yeah.
some of that sort of behavior. There's like
Sure.
an overlap, and
Got you.
you don't have to be manly man sort of
Hmm.
in the eye to be hetero, right? So anyways, so yeah, I mean that's at least made it convenient, but no, I've met people, and some of them have had it worse, or they've had fears about being kicked out. I always was worried about that on some level, but I didn't think it would ultimately happen because I didn't think I would bring it to the precipice before I would be ready for that kind of an outcome. And also, I'm very grateful for it. I feel like opinions have gotten better even within my own family. My mother knows and she's fine with it.
Hmm.
And I think the day that I tell my father, he'll probably be like, "Yeah, I figured it out a few years ago and I didn't care." But I just haven't crossed that bridge yet. So,
Yeah.
but fortunately, my story's not too bad. But I do know some other people who've had a greater struggle with it, and but that's not to diminish that in those moments when I was still in my teens, my late teens, like it was scary to think about like, well, I had that previous experience and that was the attitude um and while I had a lot of courage about okay, this is how I'm gonna play it all and deal with it and comport myself, um it always lingered. And I also you had to deal with the weight of feeling like you couldn't be your full self, or if you had some significant other, there was not going to be a chance of talking about bringing them to the holidays or anything like that.
Oh.
And it just like, even if you weren't going to do that anyway, like just knowing that it's not on the table for you, like that affects you on some level. So, um, but yeah, so it's, again, I'm very grateful that the younger Gen Z folks don't really have to as likely go through some of the things that we went through, even if it was very formative for me.
Hmm.
And I'm grateful for how that has shaped me as an individual. I'm glad that they don't have to deal with it as
Yeah,
much.
yeah, that is good. Um, Yeah, you got me so excited talking about it. I really want to go back and play those games because that is so true. I didn't even think about that connection of like using the same weapons against them, and also this is my last comment on it, but like a really cool like something else that always kind of stuck out to me was that these angels seem like really scary looking, like they're the monsters, they're the bad guys of the video game, which is like very it's not traditional. Like in a traditional video game, it would be the other way around. But the fact they look so demonic and monstrous is kind of biblically accurate anyway. But it's also
Yeah.
deep on the level in that like it's kind of like you're looking at something that you are supposed to just believe blindly with blind faith is your savior. But if you look closer, like who's the real monster here? You know what I mean? It's easy to look at
Yeah.
Bayonetta as like the slutty witch that has like a provocative outfit and the way that she talks and everything, and it's destroying angels and telling them to flock off or whatever. But if you look at like the story and the lore, it seems like it's pretty easy to be on her side. So yeah, there's a lot of cool connections from there.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. I think that philosophically, especially with some of the existential themes in three, I think she really takes that sort of assessment that you have and runs with it even further. And yeah, I really do love because if you read the descriptions of these enemies, they often talk about aspects of human nature, which I think is really cool.
yeah.
And I think, yes, it sort of speaks to the fact that we do have these light and dark aspects, broadly speaking, about human nature. But there are bad things about both sides, and there are good things about both sides. I mean, there is such a thing as being too compassionate to someone, right? I mean, like, we're all talking these days about how helicopter parenting is so dooming and damaging
Hmm.
and restricting to the kids, right?
Hmm.
And also, yeah, there's been a lot of atrocities committed over the years, not just from ideological extremist totalitarian figures of the 20th century, but for many centuries prior to it in the name of religion, right?
Mm.
And in the name of some of these higher moral deeds and callings and virtues, and unfortunately, not really surviving much scrutiny when you really think about it. And yeah, I think, I mean, it is almost on some level, particularly the first game, sort of like if you've ever read about some of the horrors of Christendom during the medieval era, it feels like payback. It's like, oh, fuck off, right? Like
Mm.
it's just, like you're going after these forces that have done a lot of damage, and I think also for homosexuals, like particularly in the first game, like if you're fresh off of accepting yourself and coming out, like it's kind of liberating the way that her personality is in that game. I mean, she's like wild and loose, and she doesn't, partly because she's not sure of herself, and so she's not taking herself too seriously. She's just trying to enjoy the ride because she doesn't really know what the hell's going on, and I think it's just sort of there's like a development or an evolution as the games go on. She's like, wait, I have more stakes in this world. I figured myself out more. And she takes the role that she's playing, that she's discovered that she's now playing, a lot more serious. But in that early game, when it's just like, no, this is who I am, and I'm here, and as long as the music keeps going, I'll keep on dancing, right? Like that sort of energy for someone who's just fresh into figuring out who they are, like it vibes with them, and again, the whole fight that I've sort of set up there, it just feels like it's your way of saying I'm not going to let what other people think about me for whatever reason, moral or pious or whatnot, get in the way of me being me. And I think that just feels really, really awesome. And again, Kami is obviously not homosexual, but somehow he created something that, I mean, people. It's so crazy when you think, and I don't mean to open a new can of worms here, but like when you think about like Gamergate in 2014 and how Bayonetta 1 and 2 was sort of brought up about all of it,
Uh-huh.
and they were like talking, well, it's like, okay, for some women, they also looked at her as she was empowering, but also to LGBT individuals, she was very empowering as well. And so this idea that she was just like objectifying women and it was baseless and all that, like it could not have been further from any sort of strong literary analysis of what was actually being explored and demonstrated in her character and in the story. So yeah, and I'm glad that mainstream, even feminist opinion has evolved on that
Hmm.
too. And they see her as, no, she is actually a role model. It's like, yes, this is not just Bane, sexy women killing things and it's cool. It's no, it goes a lot deeper, especially if you actually read the text in the game, which obviously not everyone does.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah,
yeah,
some people just want to
that's
press
really
some
cool.
buttons, which is like me. I didn't spend a whole lot of time reading either, but I still got that sense from the character. It's funny because like when I was growing up, I was a lot more prudish about all that sort of thing. So I was very I had like a natural aversion to that sort of thing. So that's the reason I never really wanted to touch Bayonetta. But after like playing through it and getting older and kind of like reconstructing my the way that I'm viewing sexuality, not like in a personal sense. I'm pretty sure like I've figured out where I'm at sexually, but when it comes to just like how I view the world philosophically, like I am a lot more. What would you say? I feel a lot more happy and proud looking at someone like Bayonetta for the same reasons that you described. It's a lot less of someone, like I said earlier, just being hoish or just trying to, or just purely for the male gaze, which I'm sure has a strong marketing purpose behind it. I think that there is that meaning that they're utilizing as well. Because that is kind of like how I feel about things. Like lately, I've been kind of realizing like um, people got to stop being so embarrassed, just kind of be themselves and just fucking do it. If you, a lot of people are scared to send something or start something they're really passionate about just because they're really intimidated about being added into a cringe compilation or something. And there's good reason for that because you have people that in a way get canceled for something super cringy, but then you have people that will commit atrocities and they're still the most popular people in existence. It's like how do you handle those two things? Like clearly our priorities on judgment is it's a little off, I think. What do you think about that?
So I was reading your Substack article last night about why we need validation and why that's partly a problem. And I went to bed. I was trying to sleep, and I was thinking about that image of whatever content girl slop creator pushing a homeless person off a boardwalk. I think for the promise of money or something. Actually
Well,
I
not
may have
pushing, just to
seen
be
that
clear, but like convinced her to
or
do it
just
for
telling them
money.
to jump
Yeah,
on.
and what she did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I think I maybe had seen that at the time, but I had forgotten about it because I actually didn't really know who she was when it happened, or still now. I'm thinking, wow, like because of your interest of wanting to make money, knowing that people love to stare at the car crash and rubberneck and go, oh wow, that actually I have to look at it, and it works, and it's like an exploitation of human nature. But and yeah, it would fill your pocketbook up a bit. But you were comfortable exploiting the trust and the dignity of another human being who is struggling in misfortunate circumstances that you have no idea how much is even their fault or not. I mean, it really, when you take a step back, it's baffling and it's so sad. And it's really hard. I mean, here we are, two temperamentally liberal people, and politically to some extent, obviously, as well. And like we're the ones who are sitting there thinking like, oh wow, society's kind of went to shit, and like we live in this highly performative era where everyone is just trying to sort of go on social media and virtue signal and perform in a way that positions them to be worthy of people's continued clicks and approval and attention. Um, and it's just sad because the good stuff, the best of humanity, is not what's rising to the top. It's this awful, evil crap. I mean, thinking about the guy who you also mentioned who got in the car crash because for the content, like it's just insane.
Yeah.
Like why? But I mean, and someone who's paid attention and looked at the psychology of it all, like I can explain it.
Mhm.
But I just think it's sad. It's really unfortunate. But you can't. can't ultimately make people care about what truth is if they don't themselves want it. I mean, it's kind of like people who maybe should go on a diet or not. Like that's up to them, and if they don't want to, even if they're having health problems because of it, like they're not going to. And uh, a lot of conversations have been had in the wake of the election from members of the media talking about, well, what can we do to win over the trust of voters and more American citizens? And it's like, I do think that there are things that they can think about that could help, but I think there's also on some level, like, there are just different kinds of consumers. Just like when it comes to food, there are some people who want to go to Panera and Whole Foods, and there are other people who want to go to McDonald's and KFC. And on some level, we're just not going to actually go back to the mid late 20th century where most Americans were reading and consuming legacy media and trusted names and fact-based reporting and all that. They're wanting to hear and be entertained by people who are selling information in ways that is palatable to them. And because we've fractionated so much in our media and our information streams that it's just this choose your own adventure, and people are happy with that. I look, it's a great thing that they have choice, and it's not just three networks. But it's also really there's a lot of risks. I mean, people, just to take a step back historically, people will think about the printing press and what a wonderful revolution that was to be able to further disseminate information. And look, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, they were boosted and accelerated by the advent of the printing press. But the fact of the matter is that was like over 200 years after the advent of the printing press. What happened in between then was the beginning and the worst phase of the European witch hunts and some of the worst religious wars of the continent.
Hmm.
And it was because of the kind of pamphlets that people were able to create and disperse. Basically, to borrow Steve Bannon's term, flooding the zone with shit and getting people riled up about other people. And look, more information is not does not correlate to creating more truth. If you flood the zone with more information, you just get truth sinking to the bottom because truth itself is something that is really precious and rare and
Mm.
hard to sort of find and determine. And you can flood the wells with a bunch of poisonous other information that's not actually all that truthy. But it could be emotionally salient and motivate people to do things that are
Right.
awful that they wouldn't otherwise want to do.
Right. That's such a good point. And that you remind me of this idea, like, and I get this. I noticed this before the term was coined, but they say that it's like when you talk to people that go down those conspiratorial rabbit holes, which is typically at this point pretty much anybody that is strong MAGA, right? I think most people would agree with that. They're almost self-proclaimed conspiracy theorists, and when you talk to these people, they like it's like playing whack-a-mole because like you might be able to refute one point, but they're like instead of just addressing in good faith, like okay, maybe I was wrong about that. Like, well, no, what about this? Well, what about this? What about this? And I noticed like it's hard because like I have to like be an expert on each of these points because I know more about them. Like for instance, somebody reached out to me and messaged like and was trying to convince me that Haitians were eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. And they sent me and I'm like, how do you know this? And they're like, dude, like it's already been proven. There's video footage, there's a police report, all this stuff. And I was like, well, send me your proof. Show it to me. I haven't seen it. And they sent me a Twitter link of somebody. I'm sure you've seen a clip of this around before. It's popular. I'll link it and I'll show it on video now too. But it was the link itself proved that he was wrong. The person there was a native to Ohio. I don't think it even was in Springfield, but the police report didn't even mention she was eating cats, and there's no other official police report claiming that this was the case either. The official police department of Ohio has said that that this is not a credible thing that's going on. And in the very Twitter link that they were sending, it said that in the community notes, it said that within the police report that they sent me, and they sent me two other ones pertaining to the same thing, and wouldn't address or admit that they were wrong there. And rather than even sticking to that topic, they moved on entirely from the Haitian eating pets argument and moved on to like Bill Gates with nanobots and the vaccines or whatever else. So you have to know all of them. And it really is like playing whack-a-mole. So it got to the
Oh
point
yeah.
where I kind of felt like it's not really worth the energy. But the reason that I still feel so motivated to like write and talk about this is because I agree with Peterson when he said that the alternative to talking is fighting. And I think we're already like at that transitional fate. We're already kind of there. And it's a scary position to be in. And when you have people that disagree so strongly, not just on a matter of opinion, but on fundamental facts, then I think you have a really scary recipe. So I think that you're right. Like people are prioritizing, like you said, information over truth. People like even Peterson now, and all the people on the Daily Wire, really, most of the right wing alternative media is just pushing talking points and another little mole that pops out of nowhere that you have to keep whacking. And that's what they worry about, just getting a bunch of information out there so that way someone like Trump can come out and say, what? It's obvious. I know it. You, everybody knows it. They're always talking about it. And when people that are not as like informed as you or I are, that don't really read or follow politics very much or any of the news cycle, they're just going to believe what they heard of. They're going to have a few flashes of images in their head. They're going to hear Biden gaffing. They're going to remember that the Democrats kept insisting that he was perfectly senile and there was no cognitive decline. And they're going to see that as a lie. They're going to see Donald Trump get shot in the ear and then get up with his fist up. And that's all that they're really going to care about. So when you point out to them that these people are being supported by people like Aiden Ross, who knows nothing about politics, someone like Candace Owens, who doesn't believe that dinosaurs even existed, they're not going to even care about that sort of thing. They're just like, whatever, dude, who cares about that? So I don't care about it. I look at the big picture, is what they say. I look at the big picture. The big
I'm just asking
picture.
questions.
Exactly. Or even that, unrelated to that, like they'll say, I'm just asking questions. You can ask questions, but like, what's your motivation? But my point was a little bit less of that, even asking questions, because you're so right. They do that very thing. They're like, it's just innocent questions. I'm not doing anything. I'm just asking, like, was Hitler really all that bad? That's all that they're doing, you know?
I
But
just wondered.
yeah, I'm just asking, like, was he like, well, you know? But they also do this thing where they'll just kind of they'll make this claim. I'm losing my train of thought, but they'll make a claim. They'll say something about Donald Trump, and they'll just kind of turn a blind eye to it because in their mind, I might not know as much as you do, Silver, but I look at the big picture. They're admitting that they're generalizing all the information, but all that does is give you a blurry image. Okay, I have like a high pixel count of everything that I'm trying to build, and I'm trying to build it with you. Like, let's look at the facts together. Let's watch the footage together. But what they'll always say is, why are you so obsessed with January 6th? That happened like 4 years ago, bro. Get over it. What do you mean get over it? You still don't believe that it happened. You still believe that it was a totally different fiasco. Yeah, so that was kind of like a rant of myself, but I got to remember that I'm interviewing you. Do you have any thoughts
No,
about what
no.
I just said?
There's so much real stuff to unpack
Yeah.
there for sure. I mean, to your first point about everything with the Haitian, as someone who lives in Ohio, let me tell you that was not going on. But what did happen though, I have some friends who live closer to Springfield, and they were concerned about what happened after those comments were made because of the kinds of weird threats, bomb threats, death threats, and also the Nazi material. And I think there was even something in the streets at some point that went on in the aftermath of that. It excited a bunch of bad people to be trolls at best and awful and potentially lethal
Mhm.
at worst. And it was really unfortunate. And yeah, the truth. And we see this every time one of these conspiracy theories, the falsehood, whatever the theory is, can easily spread so quickly before the truth can even get its pants on and out the door. Um, and yeah, I mean, there were so many of those. To your point, I don't know. I was going to ask if you, maybe it's just your internet presence and you responding to commenters, but do you live with anyone who is sort of consumed in the MAGA ecosystem? Because I do. I do love my parents, but my mother is an avid Fox News consumer, and yeah, I mean, I've done the same sort of song and dance that you're talking about with all the whataboutism and the excuse me, the mole whacking,
Mhm.
because it's well, it reminds you about why did our species develop rationality in the first place? And it wasn't because we wanted to be a truth-seeking species. It was because, okay, we're both in the cave, we're starving. I need you to go out there and get the food. I want you to do it, and I'm going to make the case for it so that I don't have to risk going out and dying and not being able to reproduce. That was
Mm.
sort of evolutionary over a long period of time. Those who were better at developing that skill were more likely to continue on and to pass on their genes. And that is sort of when you really understand and appreciate that that is the ancestral source of our ability to be rational and to use that as a tool for seeking truth. It also explains why you have to honestly be a freak to really be more truth oriented rather than self-serving, bias oriented, like we all are default programmed to be on some level, right?
Yes.
And to your other points, more broadly about all of it, it's just, yeah, I mean, when they're telling you that they're zooming out and they're looking at the big picture, it just speaks to the fact that it isn't, this is not about the truth. This is
Mm-hmm.
about whatever it is that their agenda is or their goals, or more broadly, it's just, look, people trust is really the biggest dividing line right now. Do you trust institutions? Do you trust your fellow citizens? Um, do you trust what people claim to be fact-based or whatnot, or do you trust the people who tell you, no, 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 you're being fooled? It's a lot easier to tell people that, oh no, don't believe that they're trying to trick you,
Mm-hmm.
rather than to actually be like, wait, no, this person who is saying that is actually tricking you. I call them like the neo-Orwellians because they're like wrapping themselves in Orwellian language about, oh, well, they're gaslighting you, or this administration is authoritarian, all that kind of stuff. When they themselves are doing the sort of actual sleight of hand tricks about information and what is real and what isn't real, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really it's difficult because and also think about this: anytime there's ever been some sort of failure by government or institutions or society, aspects of society, that hurts people's ability to trust one another, right? Because they've been wronged. For me, so just zooming out on my own sort of epistemic journey, I first began sort of, yes, I'm paying attention in school and all that, and that's great. But I had struggled with weight majority of my life, and I was following the food guide pyramid, and my first quote unquote red pill was realizing that
Mm-hmm.
that was a load of crap. That the macronutrient breakdown of those recommendations was akin to the diets of livestock when they're trying to fatten them up. And obviously, we know that we all share enough genetic traits with other mammals and whatnot that that analysis is portends a lot of doom if you're trying to follow it for yourself
Right.
and lose weight. And so then it was like, okay, well, I can't trust some of these things actually. Like, wait, maybe I guess people do have ulterior motives and agendas. And there have been a lot of failures. Some of them have been benign or just sort of, people trying their best and coming up short. But some of them have been grifts and corruption. And that's, yeah, you benefit as an individual until you get caught. But like in the long term, that risks the erosion of trust. And it's really hard to win it back, particularly when we have such a loneliness epidemic in this country. Like, if you don't have any other friends and you don't really get along with your family, but there's this online rabbit hole for you to go down, and it
Mm-hmm.
sort of, like, think about QAnon. Like, you were kind of like a player in that saga. Like, they were trying to sort of together figure out what the next clue was going to be about all of this, or what the next thing was. I mean, this was something that brought people together. There was things that they could feel like they were getting better at. They were playing a role in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think you could have designed a better thing to sort of form a community around and engage people than the way that that sort of worked. But it was something to fill the void for people. And Fareed Zakaria wrote and published a book he'd been writing for 10 years earlier this spring. And it was Age of Revolutions. And one of his main premises in the book is this idea that one of the challenges of liberal democracy is that individuals in a liberal democracy have to actually figure out what they're going to do with their lives. And that is a big responsibility, and it can be challenging, especially if you weren't supported in part of your childhood and early adulthood. It's like, what am I going to make of my life? Even if you have been supported, it's like, it's still sometimes, it can be a daunting question. a strong man offers an answer for that. You don't have to worry about it. Here is what we care about. These are the important things. These are the good people. These are the bad people. We're fighting against these bad people. It fills the void.
Hmm.
And so when you really kind of think about all of this and why the people who are skeptical of truth and institutions are sort of gravitating towards more populist and autocratic figures and movements and ideas. I mean, this is sort of the connective tissue in amongst human nature that explains it. And it's really difficult to combat it because now, I mean, first of all, you can't fact check someone out of their own identity, but sort of you're trying to get them to sort of see the truth about things. That's already difficult. But then it's like you're trying to tell them, stop being friends with these people, stop associate, like it's not healthy. Like it's just really it's so thorny on how you try to sort of heal these people. And honestly, I think the best way is with empathy and over time and one-on-one interactions and developing a relationship. You can't do that at scale. And so when you
Hmm.
have a society that is in the place that it's in, I think it's very important that everyone understand all of the actions that they do, whether that builds trust or it takes trust away from it. Because just to circle back to your point, if they're saying we're zooming out, it's not about the truth. It's just, well, but this is the broader point. What they're trying to say is, okay, well, yeah, so you have this argument and it's about like the merits of what actually happened or whatnot, but that doesn't matter because we don't trust you.
Hmm.
And we actually only trust this guy, Donald Trump or whoever, or this idea. And it doesn't really matter what you say. I mean, because after all, these people, like in terms of epistemology, they're what we call epistemic freezing, right? They epistemic seize and freeze. Like, okay, I'm going to trust this thing or this piece of information. Now I'm frozen, and you can't. There's no amount of information that you could give me that's going to sort of
And they
unfreeze
do it
me.
like almost intentionally.
Yeah, and it's like bad faith, right? But like that's the point. And so I think like you can't truth scold people or shame people out of. I mean, think about it. Like people want to sort of, I don't like this opinion or this rhetoric. You're kind of racist. And yeah, I think it's a good instinct to want to sort of help mold people in a better direction on those
Hmm.
things. But like you have to realize like are your tactics more about you feeling righteous or are they more about trying to actually bring people into the fold in a way that actually might make a difference?
Right.
And if you push them out, there's a whole movement in this country that will accept them. Yeah, they called us racist. Yeah, they called us conspiracy theorists. Come on in, the water's just fine. Like, and I think that really explains this election a
Hmm.
lot. Is that we didn't learn the lesson of 2016, and that was this idea that Donald Trump was taking advantage of the loss of trust in institutions against people who were defending the status quo.
Hmm.
And I think the scenario and the tactics were different, and there were improvements. But like the fact of the matter was that it was really taken for granted that where trust was and how
Yes.
much of it had actually been lost since
Yeah.
2020, and that you could just sort of through information. Oh, but he never accepted the last election result, and his tax plans are actually, or tariff plans and mass deportation. That's going to be massively inflationary. Like this idea that information alone was going to close the gap. And yeah, obviously this was no landslide mandate, as some people have claimed it. Right? It was like what the 46th biggest, and by 46, that's there's not many smaller than this sort of electoral victory. Um, it's a really tight thing. It was close,
Hmm.
but like if you had more people who were willing to trust you on these things, and obviously there's a lot both from the leadership perspective and the role of individuals, I mean, you could have had a different outcome. But the fact of the matter is that if we don't actually figure out how to engage in combat in terms of winning back trust, um, people who are disappointed for whatever reason, and then listen to people who are sort of uh, playing into that, whether they're conspiracy theorizing and saying it's not your fault, it's this person's fault, this group's fault, or just sort of not being the most honest broker, but at least sort of engaging in it, they're going to win those people over. I think one last thing, just, and I want to give it back to you, but like one last thing on this is like it cannot be overstated how much decline there is in media literacy um, in this country. I mean, people just don't understand how to think about the way that they're consuming information and what's being presented to them and how this gets created and who pushes it and why they might do that. Like that is a skill set that takes time to develop. It takes experience. It takes listening to other people talk about it and analyze it. That's certainly not happening in high school,
Hmm.
and I don't think if you're not getting it in school, you have to basically be motivated to figure it out on your own or have friends who are willing to talk about it like you and I are doing right now. And I think for the majority of Americans, let's be fair. Like, there's only 24 hours in a day. It's just not maybe the biggest priority.
Yeah.
But they also have to make choices and vote on things, and they do, even though maybe they don't actually understand where their information is coming from.
Hmm. Probably putting their faith in the wrong places. I mean, like you said, you're so right. I mean, like not everyone has the same amount of time that we do to investigate and research this stuff, and even more than that, not everyone has the same temperament to do so. I mean, I understand people not being interested enough to do it. I hardly am. I don't even enjoy politics. The only reason I had a rule that I would never discuss politics. The only reason that I am is just because of how much it's overlapping with everything else that I'm looking at. Where now people are starting to think like, is the earth round? Like, are you like at that point, like I have to start like reevaluating why is this happening? And it seems to be stemming through media, which is just in tandem with politics. It's through the political rhetoric. So that's why I've gotten involved, at least with the conversation. Do you think you mentioned how we need to like learn lessons from the 2016 election, and I think just the overall discussion with how people are starting to lose faith in our institutions, which is a problem. I mean, without having faith in our institutions, then how can we operate? But you also have to, like you said, to have some empathy for people that are struggling with that inner turmoil. Like you, I also have family and people in my life that are very much down that MAGA rabbit hole. And what makes me sad about it is that these people, like, not all of them are stupid, believe it or not. They've just been led astray, and not all of them are bad, racist, bigoted people. Some of them genuinely think that Trump isn't a bigot or isn't racist or isn't sexist. They think that it's everyone else accusing him of that for just being edgy. That's what they think. Now you can give them specific examples, but they'll wave it away because, like you said, they've already found their ideological framework that they're comfortable to freeze in. I've had people tell me that very same thing when I point out to them a new fact, a new fact. Like they do whack-a-mole. I was prepped. I had my Obsidian folder. I'm ready to go. And I told them every counter I could. And their response was admitting that they can't beat me in that debate, which is just to say, like, you know what? We're not going to convince each other of anything. And that always irritates me because I'm like, you can convince me of something. It's that you're refusing to be convinced of something. I am open-minded to being wrong. I just am providing you something that you can't counter. So what made me depressed about that is I don't really know how else to handle it. And what I noticed was most effective was taking a page out of the book of people like Trump and just instead of going on the substance, which I wish I could rely on entirely, I tried to make it as substantive as possible though, even though I did this other tactic, which is just to criticize the person that they're getting their news from. Like when they always send me like links from Twitter or whatever or Daily Wire, and I'll be able to point out to them, here's an example of uh, Candace Owens saying something like that dinosaurs are fake and gay, or that vaccines don't work, or whatever. And here's the reason why that's wrong. Here's information on mRNA vaccines. Here's why they are in fact actually vaccines. Here's how we know that dinosaurs existed. When you get to that point, it's like you kind of realize it's really hard to argue with someone if you're trying to convince them that dinosaurs are real. But even though you're giving them all this information, it doesn't really do anything because they're just going to think it's either fake news or that I must be wrong because even if that person's wrong, yeah, Candace Owens might be an idiot, Silver, you're right, but this guy isn't, and then there's this guy, and then there's this guy, and you have to. It's another whack-a-mole thing, no matter what you do. My question to you that I kind of want to go in this direction is, um, when it comes to Democrats failing, it does kind of feel like Democrats, like to me, in my opinion, it feels like the Democratic Party, has been failing quite miserably. It's not really capturing media the way that the Republicans and the conservatives successfully are doing. It's like they're relying on this status quo. Like, listen, you've always trusted us. Like we've worked our way up, and they don't really. I think they're like tone deaf to how many people are actually starting to get suspicious of people that are in those positions of power. especially for when they've held them for so long, like Nancy Pelosi. When there's no term limits for stuff like that, people are going to be asking like, why aren't there term limits? Why do I have to listen to them? Why does what they say matter more than this guy? Um, do you think what do you think needs to change in the Democratic Party? What are some ideas that you have? Like if you were given granted, we'll do whatever you suggest, what would you tell them to do? And what do you think is like the biggest mistake that they made? But before you answer it, can we take
Mhm.
like a fiver so I can go to the bathroom and get more water?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and you can do the same. And then when you're back, let me know. I'm gonna go do that because I have to go really bad. I'll be back.
Okay.
The question was pertaining to like if you have suggestions for the Democratic Party, if you were given like full power, or they said we'll do whatever you say, what would you do? And I wanted to just like to add one thing. Like in my experience growing up, um, yeah, I'll give like an anecdotal experience, but tell me if you disagree with this. It seems like um, liberals for the past decade or two especially, have had a problem that conservatives didn't quite have. They still had it too, but not to the same degree, which is that like a liberal would call you an imbecile or a fool for having the opinions that you had, but a Republican would be more interested in like agreeing to disagree. And I think that made them by default kind of seem rational as opinions started to get more and more fiery and more passionate. And when people were a lot more ideologically driven, that are not only do they say it's my way or the highway, but like you are less, you're not as good as me. You have some like I would see clips when I was a kid of like Anna Kasparian saying like I'm better than you. You're a bigot. When I know in my heart, even though I disagree with her, I'm not a bigot. I'm not a racist. And when I was younger, when I was like a little kid, I was always pro life just because growing up with that ideological framework, I just thought it made sense to me. Like a baby that's a baby, it's a fetus, it's still going to be a human someday. And so in my mind, I didn't want to kill anything. So, but when people would say like, "Oh, you just want to control a woman, you just don't care about that," it's like that's not true at all. It's not that I don't care about people's right to make decisions for their own body. It like, and but because people kept telling me that's what I thought, it just would kind of make me feel even more validated and believe in what I did. Especially when you had conservatives that would say like, "Hey, you can come to ours," like you said, jump in the water, it's fine. Come chill with us. They'll come to the barbecue. Um, but liberals were like, nope, like you're annexed. You're like annexed. Like we're totally against you. Um, and like the only thing that would really save me from like getting stuck in that conservative mindset was that I have a natural temperament to want to investigate and learn. I still have my own implicit biases that I have to challenge all the time, but it's not common, I find, for people to be so comfortable or willing to kind of go outside of their comfort zone to learn something new when it contradicts their worldview. So I'm not pro choice anymore, or it's certain. I've gone back and forth. I'm like I'm not 100% like where I land on this, but I definitely am not pro choice. I'm not quite that, or sorry, I'm not pro life. I'm not pro life anymore because um, I've after analyzing those arguments more closely, I've shifted the way I think. Um, but that's a different discussion. The
Mhm.
the point is more like, do you think that the Democrats kind of screwed themselves over by demonizing the other side too much? Um,
Oh,
yeah. What do you
yeah,
think?
absolutely. I mean, it turns out that if you tell voters they're stupid or backwards for thinking the way that they do, even if, like you said, you're just naturally curious, but you're in this position in them. Yeah, it turns out that that's the politics of subtraction, and you can only do that for so long before you're not winning durable majorities. I mean, think about it. Like, there used to be Democratic senators, like Joe Manchin, who obviously is retiring now. Didn't used to always be the zebra that he had been for the last few years. There used to be more Democratic senators in rural states. And now there aren't. And literally, I think now that because of the outcome in Ohio, I think there's only like four states left or three that have two different party senators. I think it's like Maine, Pennsylvania, and I can't remember the other one. So yeah, it's uh, but it used to be that you could have, and part of it also was obviously there was a realignment during the late 20th century because of Nixon's Southern strategy and the direction that JFK and LBJ pursued the Democratic Party in. But And so for a while, I mean, there were actually experts and political scientists that said that the parties are too similar, and that it's confusing for voters. Oh, how quaint of a problem that seems like in this polarized day and age. But yeah, so to your point, um, I think before I answer what they should do, something interesting. So first, I am trying to write, as you know, we've mentioned this before,
Hmm.
but for the viewers, I am trying to write an article about this topic that I would hope that the Atlantic magazine would publish. So if it does publish, we'll let you know, and so you could read my full fleshed out thoughts about all of this and how trust, not truth, decided the election and what that means for both leaders and individuals. But um, let's, to your point about like the last decade, let's look at it through the lens of me. So I mentioned like at the start of the 2010s, like I'm like red pilled about the food guy pyramid being jank and thinking, oh well, what else are they lying about? And this has clearly failed me, and I'm already struggling with my identity in one way. This has now compounded it. Um, but then it was like, so you had Donald Trump in 2016 in the first campaign, and yeah, he was palatable and appealing because it was like well, I feel like the status quo had failed me, and um, here he was saying, "I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to be bought and paid for. I'm going to run for you." Like the rhetoric was a lot different in 2016 than it was in 2024. Let's be clear about that. But like, not that it wasn't there weren't problems, obviously, but for me, early in my epistemic journey, it was like, yeah, I felt like that was something, and I was consuming a lot of different media at that time because I was just trying to learn what is the media landscape like. And there were people from that I knew on different sides of
Hmm.
the equation that would tell me, "Oh, don't listen to this." Don't, and I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna go listen to it now. I'm gonna go form my own opinion."
Right.
And so, even by the end of the campaign, I was starting to have like, "Oh, I don't know about him on some of these things," but I did trust him a lot more than Hillary Clinton, who, if you actually take a large look at her career, she has some wins and she has some things, accomplishments and highlights to brag about. But particularly if you were not someone who was an ideological person in that election and you felt uncomfortable about how things were going or you just didn't feel like you were seen or heard, I mean, that was the last candidate that you would want defending the establishment because she was very much the status quo incarnate. And then she had all these airs of corruption. Even if it wasn't, that was largely not true.
Hmm.
It stank.
Yeah.
And James Comey obviously reopened. So that's where I was in 2016. Now, fast forward to 2020. Like, in, as you know, I've written a bunch of debate analysis pieces during the primary season for that campaign, and I was really sort of getting to better understand the Democratic coalition and how these candidates were vying for different lanes and whatnot. It was very fun and eye-opening for me. For any political junkie, we had such a paltry uh, uh, primary this year.
Hmm.
I mean, it was really more of a fantasy primary. It didn't matter. It was
Yeah.
so, oh God, we were starving. But 2020 and 2016 were rich. They were wonderful. Anyways,
Yeah.
but so I'm learning about all that. But even in my final primary debate analysis, I had in my winners and losers, I had Donald Trump as a winner because I felt like Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders didn't do themselves enough favors in that. But man, what a difference did the pandemic make, right? Like it really broke through in a lot of ways. That I mean, you had Americans sadly dying on ventilators. They were literally on their deathbeds, and people who even into 2021 after the vaccines were out were. I mean, there's reporting about them begging nurses saying, "Give me the vaccine. I'm sorry I didn't listen to my family and friends." And it's really tragic, but it's like, when we were in the midst of disaster, people wanted truth. They wanted expertise because they knew, okay, this guy who we thought was going to shake things up, yeah, he had shook things up, and we're poor for it. And in this moment where we don't have actual leadership or strong governance, I mean, you had states bidding against each other for materials, right? Instead of some sort of orderly process. It was just
Yeah.
chaotic. It was a never ending, and for me, it wasn't just me. It was obviously the country at large. that really broke through, and people wanted a return to expertise and leadership, the so-called adults in the room,
Yeah.
and so Joe Biden entered the White House north of 50%, and for the first time in 4 decades, a majority of Americans preferred more government in their lives than less. They wanted institutions to come save them, but there were a lot of key moments between 2020 and then where they pissed away some of that trust because of just not understanding how Biden, as a president, his sort of defensive, truth scolding posture, whenever he was ever asked about, well, why are Americans still unhappy about the economy, or what are you going to do about inflation? And his whole sort of shtick, in a nutshell, was basically, I'm doing the best I can. If you would just pay attention to the facts, you would know that we're trying to hurt all the risk. We're doing what we can do, and it's just, why are you asking? I mean, he would even get angry and
Yeah.
defensive sometimes,
Yeah.
and it was just, that's not how you like garner trust. And so, if you think about through that lens, but for me personally, like the pandemic was so clarifying from an epistemic standpoint of, okay, clearly these people have lost the plot. Some of the things that they're saying about vaccines, the lawsuits that came out after the 2020 election for some of these media outlets like Fox I mean, I never entertained really Newsmax or OAN, but like it was just so clear who was doing what they were doing epistemically and why, as far as the information that they were channeling. But for me, I just became so instead of being in this place of I'm not really sure what the hell is going on, but I'm trying to figure it out, I became a lot more certain in my information streams and who I could trust and who I couldn't. And I was excited to maybe get past the Trump era and maybe the GOP would be a good faith conservative party post the Trump era. But like, if Kamala Harris won this election, but the fact of the matter was that I became a bit nose blind because the average American, yes, in that moment, they were upset and they felt like they needed the experts, but then the experts also failed them when it came to prices and a couple other key issues, and they turned on them. And the fact of the matter, there's a Gallup poll, like 55% of Americans don't like politics because they can't tell what is true or isn't true. I mean, that's a damning indictment of where we're at. But then if you think about that, which that poll had released, I think a few months before the election, this strategy that if you just inform them, if you just tell them the truth, like it's the Achilles heel of liberals thinking that everyone is like them. Oh, if they're all truth seeking, if we just give it to them, they get it.
Yeah.
And it's like that's not how it works. You have to fight for to win over their trust. And so to answer your question about what everything has to be done through both policy and messaging has to be done through the lens of how does this impact trust. Like if this was a company, I would say you need a chief executive officer of trust, someone whose job is explicitly to think about these things and do things to contribute
Yeah.
on making sure that performance metric is moving in the right direction. Like it has to be something huge and fundamental because something to your earlier point when just talking about how flooded the zone is and everything. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's a big difference between the two parties in that the Republican Party is bolstered by this disinformation ecosystem that floods and pumps out and repeats and repeats and repeats the same sort of misinformation. And that's obviously powerful, right? Like Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda guy, made it very clear that, yeah, you just repeat a lie enough times and people will believe it. And I think, but the interesting thing, it's not necessarily that people are being fooled because they're trying to figure out the truth and they believe that that's the truth. Maybe on some level for some people it is, but it's about you have the trust and now people aren't going to really question or dig into the details and they're just going to repeat what they've heard be repeated to them so many times. And I think why that's an important distinction is it means these Americans who have sort of fallen prey to some of this misinformation, I think they're winnable. I think you can win them back. I still believe in the fundamental decency of humanity. I think that there's just a lot of complicating factors to everything, and bad incentive structures can really empower people to do a lot of awful and use their abilities for bad. But the fact of the matter is that like when you look at even in the exit polls, like people who voted for Donald Trump in 2024, they some of them, like anywhere between a ninth and a sixth of them, depending on the question, they were concerned about some of his rhetoric or his policies, but they just felt like they trusted him anyway on these things. And so I think that sort of speaks to the fact that you could win these people's trust back, and it's not, oh, like the answer isn't the Democrats need to create their own sort of media ecosystem that pushes out and amplifies and repeats their information as much as what the Republicans have. Yes, amplification would help. They certainly don't have their content amplified nearly like what you have with the disinformation on the right. But that alone is not going to close the trust gap. And it just sort of one question that's so central to all of this is this idea of, does the left need their own Joe Rogan? No, it's ridiculous. Obviously, Joe Rogan several years ago was a Bernie bro. He liked Bernie Sanders, but he now feels comfortable with the arguments and the rhetoric that are coming from the right and Donald Trump. This is a guy who clearly is curious. I don't know how much his mind retains information or ideas, but like he's movable and he moves and he shifts. But like I believe that someone like AOC or Mayor Pete Buttigieg, he could probably go on, or she could go on and do come out of that interview with him being convinced of a handful of things or ideas. Democrats have to be willing to go into these spaces. The fact that they're not sort of
Hmm.
speaks to this idea, circling all the way back to the earlier point in all of this, of yeah, this idea like we can just castigate and ostracize and that will work. And yeah, it's like an instinct in human nature, right? Because for much of our history, if you weren't in the tribe, if you weren't in the good graces of society, you were kicked out, you were probably going to starve. And so you needed to like comport yourself if you were at the threat of being kicked out and being denied the resources of the tribe. That is not where we are anymore. People really aren't starving in this country. They're just eating crap, if anything, or you know, obviously child starvation sucks. But like for the most part, people really aren't starving. And socially, relationship wise, there is this whole community for them to jump into. The internet has allowed these people to connect in ways that they might not have otherwise been able to. And um, so it's not just that it's not effective because of the way that technology has changed it, but it's also that technology has pushed Democrats and progressives to feel like they have a reward and an incentive to prioritize their self-righteousness over being effective because that is seen as more virtuous on social media. And so it's actually pernicious on both sides of the equation because of the way that technology has changed things. But you have to stand back and you have to look at yourself honestly in the mirror if you're someone who has really ostracized and pushed a lot of people out. Like, is this actually the world I want to live in? Is this actually achieving the goals that I claim that I have? And so, on one hand, I think that activists, and more so than people in the party, but also people in the party as well, need to really consider and do soul searching about what is and isn't important and what tactics are or are not working. Um, and then, yeah, they just have to be very robust and focused on the messaging that I'm not a part of the status quo that has failed you. I'm actually fighting for you in this way. I'm actually trying to make a difference in your life for the better. It's not about me. I mean, part of the damage of Joe Biden not allowing for a primary to take place wasn't just that there could have been a better candidate and there would have been less months of Joe Biden being the de facto presumed candidate and all of the baggage that came with more defensive interviews, etc. The part of the damage was also just the fact that this was a guy who promised he was going to be a generational bridge to the next generation, and that basically implied he would be a one-term president. And he also misread, and as did the rest of the party, the results of the midterm elections. Like they had favorable issues, and they overperformed. They didn't even win in 2022. I mean, they lost the House, but they did overperform. But like the candidates that everyone from Mitch McConnell on to people in the media and Democrats at large, everyone was talking about how the candidate quality issue was immense on the right. And people January 6th was a lot closer then than it was in 2024. And people were upset about this idea that you weren't going to necessarily certify the vote the way that it was, or that you didn't believe that Donald Trump clearly lost. And after all the fact checks and the audits and everything, the court cases. So it was a different environment, but it was definitely, people were still telling at the going in the polls and exit polls showing like they were disapproving of Joe Biden. But Joe Biden interpreted that as, hey, we don't normally do that well in a midterm. And part of it also is that the Democratic coalition has shifted, right? It's become much more college educated, and that is what. But college educated voters, that's only about 40% of the country. 60% are not college educated. You can't win on that alone. And so this, yes, they might be more higher propensity, more likely to turn out and off year elections, but like that 2018 and 2022 were sort of part of the illusion that they thought they had solved their trust problem,
Yeah.
when in fact it was just your coalition has shifted and you have more of the reliable voters. And in 2020, you were running against a disaster. And yeah, it's easy to run against a disaster. I've seen some people, Democratic commentators, they've sort of thrown their hands up and said, I don't want to incriminate, I don't want to point fingers.
Right.
But in 4 years, there might be some bad mistakes the Trump administration will get to run against. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure, on some level that there's a case to be made about that. After all, incumbents have lost the last three elections in this country. But like, do you really want to resign your party to being the party that can only run against disasters but can't win without them? I think that can't be the answer if they actually want to win. And obviously, for people, whether you're a partisan Democrat or not, or you're just a person who wants to see truth and good faith governance prevail, you're part of this broader coalition to defend our institutions and to rebuild trust in society. Yeah, I count myself as one of these people. I very much want them to put down some of the ideological errands or uh, the need to feel righteous and think what is actually effective. And obviously, it's going to be a lot more pragmatic and it's going to be less ideological. After all, like if you don't think about it too hard in a certain way, like that's what populism is anyway, and that's part of why Donald Trump has been successful. So yeah, I think just thinking about how the actions of individuals and leaders, whether that builds or erodes trust, if you stay laser focused on that, that is probably how you could somehow go from where we are right now to 4 years from now, having some pretty, not just, yeah, the candidates will change and you might have better candidates. You probably will have better candidates then, but you'll have better atmospherics. You'll have a better brand and reputation and mood and attitude towards your party. And if people are more willing to trust institutions, they're going to be more willing to trust people who don't want to burn the damn thing down. After all, if you don't understand, as some focus groups alluded, if you don't understand what the word authoritarian means, and you're just hearing someone saying, "Oh, he's authoritarian. He's going to undo the American way," and you're not really thinking about what that means in terms of abstract institutions, democratic norms, and all that. That kind of sounds like, oh, well, I'm defending the status quo that's failed you and that you don't
Yeah.
trust anymore. So if you do the hard work, and because again, I think the trust was lost over 4 years. It's going to take 4 years to build it back into a more competitive spot. In addition to just having better candidates, and that has to start now, or well, as soon as possible, as soon as people figure out tactically what this means. But there's a bunch of examples to look for from people like Andy Kim, who won in a Trumpy district in New Jersey, who's now their senator elect, or this other guy, I can't remember his name, but he's from one of New York's congressional districts. They've talked about their rhetoric and how that has sort of broken through. They've done listening tours of their voters who voted for Trump and him. AOC famously this month said she went online and asked politely, like, "Hey, some of my people who voted for me also voted for Donald Trump. Why did you do that?" And the answers that she got was just, "Well, I thought that you guys were clearly both fighting for us or trying to deliver some sort of benefit, and you weren't just a part of the status quo." I mean, that's there. If you listen, the voters will tell you how to win, and I think the Democratic Party in this cycle didn't want to listen. They wanted to tell people what the truth was, and they also didn't want to take risks, and they didn't want to go talk in different spaces because, oh, well, you're like legitimizing that. Okay, well, how much of a worry platforming or legitimizing? Oh, yeah, Joe Rogan said some stupid stuff. Okay, that's whether you go on his show or not isn't going to impact the fact that 15 million people are already listening to him. Either you actually play for that audience and try to speak to them, or you come off as the elitist, aloof candidate that's not willing to engage with that audience because, oh well, I don't like what they say. I don't like what, and you might have a good reason to not like everything that this, but like that's not how you win. You have to go to these places, and you can't be afraid about it. And thankfully, there are some candidates who have been willing to go into tough spaces. Like Pete Buttigieg is on Fox News a lot. And that's what we're going to need if we're going to
Yeah.
be able to win the trust back of these. You have to show up, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just there's a lot of tactics. I think my hope in the article that I'm writing is to provide an abstract framework, because every campaign is going to have to do one of their own tactics and conditions, but just even understanding the framework would be massive because honestly, the last 8 years of Democratic politics, or even 9 or 10, they clearly haven't understood how they're losing. And one last thing I'll say: how do you? Part of we've seen this in the analysis. Part of people who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, Mr. Hope and Change, ended up voting for Donald Trump and some of his darker rhetoric. How could that be possible? They both saw them as men largely out of the Washington establishment. They were change agents, and they wanted to do something different. And for you, I mean, that's the connective to, like, it's not so much a mystery. It's really about priorities and strategically what is important. Being ideologically pure or actually trying to be persuasive, earn the trust of voters, and that's part of also why I still think, again, it's not. Yes, some people like all the dark shit and everything, and they're mischief makers, but most of Americans are persuadable and they don't want autocracy. They're not happy about everything about this candidate, and you can win their trust back if you actually fight for it.
Yeah. I think that's all. I agree with pretty much most of that. I think I agree with all of it, really. Um, so you would say that Kamala Harris made a mistake by not going on Joe Rogan?
Yeah, I don't think it was fatal in the sense that that
Hmm.
alone would have changed it. But I do think it was a mistake. And I mean, she also had some trust wobbles herself, and
Yeah.
that she struggled to answer certain questions
And Tim Walz too,
about
both
her
of them.
plans. What was it?
And Tim Walz as well. Both of them had that issue.
Yeah, well, and he just flat out got things wrong from time to time, and I mean, that's not helpful, especially when you're like being the truth party and you're getting
Yeah.
it wrong.
Exactly.
um, and she just, I get it because she's a cautious and deliberative person, and I think that's actually an admirable characteristic of a leader. Like they don't assume they know everything, but you have to plant your flag in an election and be clear about it. You can always change it or shift it a little bit afterwards. But if people don't feel like you even know what you're doing, like, or what you believe in, that makes it harder for people to trust you. And so I think
Yeah.
her inability to answer questions, she did go on Fox News and have a tough interview that I think she excelled at with Brett Baer. Um, but not going on Joe Rogan or other places, it was too late. I mean, they wasted some of their momentum in
Yeah.
September,
Hmm.
and she was still bubble wrap. And lastly, I would say she what was it, the question? Oh yeah, she couldn't separate herself enough from Joe Biden, and I think partly from what I've heard in some reporting is that that was at his request. And
Hmm.
also, even if it wasn't at his request, yeah, she does want to be seen as disloyal. Oh, look at this conniving woman, and
Right. What can you
she's
do?
plotting for stuff. So, I mean, she was in a tough position, but like, she did need to make a clean break from Joe Biden. And I mean, after all, they had switched the candidates so late into the process. Like, I think voters would have allowed for it. I think it was a risk. It was a bad. for them to not take the risk on going harder at making a contrast against Joe Biden. But obviously, it didn't help that there were so many people in the 3 weeks after that debate that went absolutely bananas, saying, "No, Joe Biden's fine. We don't need to do anything," because there was in polling there was about 20% of the party, and so like I think they were right to see that that was potentially risky, but like I think, look, Democrats were going to come home. It's about the persuadable voters, and I think uh, that that was something that probably cost them in the swing states, even though it was a lot closer in the swing states, despite the sort of massive gains elsewhere, including blue states like New York and New Jersey.
Yeah, I think they had a problem with, like you said, focusing on getting information out there and being the truth party rather than just kind of talking with the people. They waited too long to go on to alternative media on the left. Um, but I think they probably, if, and you're right, like, Biden, whether he requested Kamala to do that or not, you're part of it isn't even entirely her fault. I mean, she had said multiple times that she's not anti-fracking, but people are going to keep saying she's anti-fracking and referencing what she said prior to 2020. Even though she has a Glock, they're going to keep saying, well, no, she doesn't. She still wants to ban all guns. Or if you point out she mentioned she has a gun, well, yeah, but she didn't know what kind it was or couldn't name it, so she obviously is lying. Like to her credit, like I don't know what I could do much differently. I feel like even if she did just say, here is my firm stance, what she should have done, I agree with you. I wonder if that would have even made a difference considering the climate that we've found ourselves in anyway. But I do think there might be some hope for the future in that Trump can't escape absolutely everything. As much as it really feels like he can, he can't absolutely everything. So hopefully, I will find out if I can already hear people like reacting to this. Not that they would, but and like pausing the video and saying like, "No, you're wrong." Like they can't believe anything. Like they still don't believe in dinosaurs or whatever. Like they'll believe anything. But I think that people won't be able to run away from the fact that tariffs will make things more expensive than they are now. Or a lot of Trump's claims that are failed promises, or some of his cabinet members. Like, who knows? It's going to be interesting no matter what the next few years. I just hope that it's safe. I genuinely have thought many times about like moving just for the sake of this. I'm one of those people. I don't want to. I would rather just the country work on its own, and I want to fight for what is right. But I will say that I get intimidated when I feel like I feel cynical when I'm talking with people that I know like have the potential to not when I talk to brainwashed people that don't have to be brainwashed, it's saddening and it makes me feel pessimistic about the future because I'm like, if you don't believe this, then what will change your mind? I don't think anything will. Um, but let's segue a little bit because into a bit of like the nature of what truth is. We're talking about how important it is for the sake of our elections and the whole country, actually for society. But as you and I both agree, like we're not truth-seeking machines. We didn't evolve our rationality so that we can understand what is an objective fact. We did it. It evolved because it allowed us. It helped us survive longer than people that weren't irrational, just deciding whatever. That's all it was. But it was still self-serving. So when that rational gene that we have is self-serving, it's gonna go against truth every now and then. But when we say that, we're kind of making these axiomatic claims without really defining what truth is. And when I ask people that, they always give me different answers. So I guess I should ask you first, like, how would you define or describe truth?
Yeah. So as I was prepping for this interview, the podcast recording, I was like looking at your first Substack piece, and you outlined all of most of, and then I went and checked Wikipedia for some more, but most of the concepts of truth, the theories of truth that people have, and I actually like went through. I pasted in a Word document, and I just sort of like wrote some of my thoughts before I even finished the rest of your piece. And obviously, you didn't fully expand upon your definition of truth in the piece, but you sort of gave us some nuggets to hold on to before that piece ever drops. Um, but yeah, I was going through some of these theories. For me, it's like I was like, do I develop a statement ultimately, and then we talk about it? But I also thought, well, maybe, I mean, the conversation is going to be really fascinating. I think what I would start out with is, because you had told me, and I think you might have quoted him in the piece, but that you really like Charles S. Pierce's quote of truth is tentative and dependent on scientific inquiry. Um, and then you wrote to me that, let's see, you agree with this because you think that whatever truth is, it's something out of reach for human limitation. So although we can prove something scientifically, which essentially just means falsifying everything else, we must be open to the idea that someday further investigation or scientific inquiry might enlighten us so that we must reconsider what we thought we knew. And Charles, for the uninitiated, is sort of more from the pragmatic, epistemic
Like the
school of
father
thought.
of like the philosophical. He's like the father of pragmatism or pragmatism. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think so. First of all, I really I agree with what you described to me there in that quote, because I
Hmm.
think it is true. Like I think when we think about empiricism, it is a really helpful tool for us to be able to determine what is true,
Yeah.
because of what we're able to objectively measure, and if we can replicate it, then we can feel confident that it actually pertains to something. But like obviously, though, there are limitations to that, and one of those being things that we might intuitively know to be true, intuitive wisdom. But the tricky thing with that, of course, is that the line between intuitive wisdom and intuitive delusion is blurry as heck. And we don't really know with certainty sort of how to clearly, cleanly delineate that, but you might just be wondering what are good examples of intuitive wisdom ever being correct?
Mm.
Well, there's some really profound foundational ones, and that would be um, way long into antiquity. Both Eastern and Western thought, Heraclitus of Greece um, and Buddha of the East, were thinking about the nature of reality and how for to them change was constant and everything was interrelated, and that was, but just also that things could potentially be different forms, including ourselves, and that sort of long time fascination around that. Those were long held ideas for a long time for a good reason, because it turns out it's kind of true. It just took a long time for empiricism to sort of catch back up and prove that it was true in the fields of or the theories of relativity and quantum mechanics. And the fact of the matter is, through the way that space time works, relativity theory, yeah, everything is entangled, everything is related, and you know, people are familiar with E equals MC squared. They might not be able to tell you all of the components of that equation, but what it does mean is this idea that energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. And another way of thinking of that is that actually it speaks to this quantum reality that all matter, all material is actually energy. And it's just in a different, it's represented in a different form. But like these old thinkers realized that static forms, objects, if you will, that those were more illusions to our perceptuary systems. Uh, but things were actually changing. I mean, you think about it, a house doesn't stay the same over. You have to change the roof, and the foundation sinks, and maybe it gets cracks, and everything is constantly. We're all these forces, all these different energies are entangled. But it took a long time for sort of any sort of scientific medium to catch up into realizing something that people had felt to be true for a long time. And I think that that is really interesting and humbling, because I mean there are some really hardcore empiricists who will be like, well, we don't have a study of this, we don't have measurements on that, you can't be, you're just spouting off nonsense. And it's like, okay, yeah, like granted, you know, we live in a society and some people are flat earthers, and yeah, it feels like you could have an inclination to feel that way about it, but the fact of the matter is there's actually a reproducibility crisis amongst much of the scientific literature that and academic writing that's out there, that their experiments, the results of them are not actually reliably reproducible, and yet they're quoted anyways. And it's part of the reason why you might see studies on a similar topic and they conflict a lot, but yet they're written about in ways that sounds like it would have more gravity and solidarity around that kind of conclusion. And so I think there are limits to empiricism in that sense. We could only measure what we can objectively measure, which is not everything. And yeah, it increases over time. But like, how do you make those big theory leaps? How does an Einstein think of relativity, if not for him thinking beyond the objectively knowable, measurable facts of reality, right? And yes, the measurements help end up proving it in the long run. But like, I think it just if you want to think about theories and what could be true or could actually describe something, like there is a defense and a space for intuitive intelligence, albeit it's obviously limited and it's hard to define. But ultimately, for me, when I think about what is true. I liked, kind of like you said in your Substack piece, there was a couple of these theories that you sort of liked, and your own perspective is a bit of a blend on it. For me, I liked the correspondence theory a bit, which is this idea that truth is defined by the correspondence between statements and reality. A statement is true if it accurately describes the state of affairs. I think that they're like inherently like if something is true, like it or what is truth, it has to be about things that are true. Like it has to be about things that actually happen. Like this and why or how. Like it has to actually pertain to that, right? So I don't on some level, I think it's linguistically self-evident, the
Hmm.
correspondence theory. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot, but I do think it was helpful, or like core to what is and isn't truth. I did like the pragmatic theory to some extent, but I also think that yes, truth should be reliable to help effectuate certain outcomes or goals. But truth also extends beyond that, which we can currently utilize to achieve successful outcomes. This is just an aspect of truth. So, in other words, it's just like, yes, sometimes you take lessons from something and it should work in the future in a similar scenario or something like that. But also, there are truths that you might not be able to utilize in a given scenario. You don't have the tools. Like, we're thinking about big ideas, big concepts, or wouldn't it be cool if this turned out to be true? But like, you can't do anything about it now, and that doesn't make it inherently untrue. It just like from that perspective, you can't put it into motion, bring it into fruition, but like it still could be true. Um, and then let's see, there were some theories I strongly disagreed with, and we can get into that. But there was one other theory that, um, yeah, the relativism. So truth is r- relative to different frameworks or perspectives. What is true in one context may not be true in another, depending on differing beliefs and values. Um, and I think it's interesting. Yes, I think some truth, like truth, can only be as universal as it can be.
Hmm.
Some truth is going to be limited more by its certain circumstances, but that doesn't mean that it isn't less true, or at least in those circumstances. Like it's just less universally true, but like it's not. So for me, ultimately, yeah, there are some of these theories that I have some sort of affinity to. There's some that I more strongly disagree with. But ultimately, truth is about something that actually describes what is, why,
Hmm.
how, and yeah, it's like abstractly to sort of button it into one sort of sentence is difficult, but like other than saying truth is what is true, right? Which,
Yeah.
but that's like saying A equals A,
Yeah.
right?
That's what I
So,
mean by axiomatic is like we take that statement for granted. Like truth is itself. It's if something's truthful, then it's true, or vice versa.
right.
Yeah. So
But yeah, it's, oh, go ahead.
no, you
Sorry.
first, I insist.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it's exactly it is there is this level of it's self-evidence, but like but then the question really again it's like okay, but what do we define is
Hmm.
not and to your point in your Substack piece, you're like, well, if we can prove that something isn't true, or if both parties can agree that differ in a debate, then that's clearly one way of. But I mean, I have issues with like the consensus theory, for example, because I wrote let's see where did oh yeah. So no, just as conspiracy theorists online can't make the Earth flat, nor could experts make the lipid hypothesis true.
Right.
While consensus from individuals with expertise on a subject is noteworthy, that consensus inherently does not define or confer truth
Hmm.
on towards a claim. And yeah, it's interesting because it's like some people can think that things are true, and they can comport themselves in a way that sort of makes that belief or idea or whatever they're claiming to be true have weight and influence their actions. Kind of like the way that truth is sort of a hard thing. It's going to come back and face you one way or another if you're
Yeah.
not sort of abiding by what it implicates for whatever scenario you're in. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're. I mean, sometimes if you think something's true and it's not, it would be detrimental to you because you're doing things that are
Right.
not helpful to your outcome. So just because something's weighty or people believe in it doesn't necessarily make it true. So it's very hard to just point to certain mechanisms,
Hmm.
societally or sociologically speaking, to sort of outsource defining what that is or isn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I listed those different interpretations or theories of truth from philosophy, they're not necessarily each one that I like. There's some that I actually don't really
Oh
have any
yeah.
sort of association to at all. They're just like really common ones that people, like, if you take a one-on-one course in this sort of thing, you probably would be taught those in the way that I wrote them, because those are very like they're very basic descriptions. If you read into them, they're a lot more nuanced, and that does not give it enough credit at face value. Like for instance, to say that pragmatism, something is true if it's practical, like if it's useful, if it's a useful tool, then that makes something true. I don't really necessarily agree with that because, like you said, like something might be useful, but that might not be true, right? Like Brett Weinstein, who I think is kind of another quack. I gotta be careful with who I reference, but that's where I first heard it. But there's something like when you say like metaphorical truth, like if you convince somebody that a porcupine will shoot their quills at you if you get too close, then you can prevent people from approaching the porcupine. They in fact don't do that, but people believing that would protect them from getting hurt by that. So you could argue that something that isn't true is useful. In it's useful to protect the safety of a certain tribe or anybody. But I think what's stuck out to me about pragmatism, and more specifically, as I'll write about in the next article, as the term that Charles S. Pierce coined to differentiate himself from other philosophers that started using pragmatism. Pragmaticism essentially means, from his quote, is that truth is tentative and dependent on scientific inquiry, because what makes truth tentative is fabulism or fallibilism. I forget how to pronounce it, but basically, it's what it means that something is always falsifiable. You can always revise something, no matter what you believe or see or witness. There is some other potential explanation. Um, so that's why I have like most people would probably just stick to correspondence or coherent theory like that. Those are the two most common ones because like that seems inherently true, right? A statement's true if it corresponds with reality, right? Like to say like a table's in the room, you can say that's a true statement because it makes sense that a room has space and a table can fill it in the room. It makes sense. To say that a room is in a table wouldn't be a true statement because it doesn't correspond with reality. That's not how reality works. The problem that I have with that is that technically speaking, if you want to take with respect to something like quantum mechanics, that might technically be possible. Or more, a better example might be like if you look at something like entropy, it is theoretically possible, however ridiculously unlikely, that water might pour itself out of the cup rather than into it, or like rather than like you know like water spilling, it's possible that the water might just go right into the cup. According to quantum mechanics, this is theoretically possible, and the only reason it doesn't happen isn't because it's scientifically impossible, but because it's scientifically nearly impossible. That's why it doesn't happen. But it is technically, theoretically possible. And this concept has been proven with different experiments, like the double slit experiment. There's basically proving the anti-realists back in the day, which was like that big debate between Einstein and that camp, which is like the realists versus the people that argued that the universe is not locally real. It was the two different camps. Like one side said that reality was itself, right? Like that's, the truth is just defined as it is. Like there is no wavering of it. Whereas the other camp said that no, like the example that I saw in a YouTube video once is that if you like shoot an arrow like that, and before it hits the mark, that arrow until it lands is just a hazy cloud of possibilities or probability rather than an actual arrow. That's how it works on the quantum level, and on a macro level with multicellular organisms and matter that is consisting of like multiple atoms coming together. It doesn't work quite the same way, which is why it feels so weird to us to conceptualize. We're not really meant to think in the quantum level, in that quantum realm. So that's
Right. The
why.
microscopic versus the macroscopic.
Exactly, and they have the rules. That's the reason why it was so daunting, is because the laws that work so perfectly for us in the real world, like Newton's law, like Newtonian laws of gravity and general special relativity, they start breaking down when you get to the quantum level, and then you have to employ not classical mechanics or classical physics, but quantum physics. That's the only way stuff starts to work, and then we have things that we try to blend them together, but they're not really connecting. So the point is that if you take the science and the math seriously, your your worldview goes through for a loop, because things start to break down. Things start to feel like they're paradoxical. So that's why pragmaticism stuck out so much to me, is because as someone that would like to be scientifically inclined, I want to always be open to the idea that something could revise my current understanding of the world. The same way that gravity, it makes sense at the moment to say that it is dependent upon mass and distance, but there might be a lot more to it than just that. Or maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it entirely. It's just the true way of looking at it right now, because that's what all the facts sort of point to. And that's the mentality that I sort of apply to everything in life, not just on the physical science, but even to some degree on the philosophical. Where it starts to get a little dicey is you mentioned like inherent truths. Like in my mind, I would say that it's true that my mother loves me and that I love my mother. And I don't know how I would be able to really scientifically prove that, but I know that it's true. And I think most humans kind of inherently would have similar beliefs as well. And I've asked myself before, like, is that just like a religious kind of belief? Is it one that I'm just believing, um, like, despite
Out of faith.
empiricism? Yeah, out of faith, exactly. Am I just believing that out of faith, and therefore not in the same way that I know something else to be true, like that 2 + 2 = 4 or something? And the answer to that, I would say, is probably, I'd say I know it's true through different means. This is how I would say it. If I'm being totally brutally honest, I don't know that it's true. It's somehow, however slightly possible, my mother doesn't love me, and I might be misinterpreting that. Or maybe I don't love my mother and these feelings are something else. But at that point, it's in the same way that you would argue, why bother considering that it's possible you might suddenly combust out of nowhere and just die right here? Physically speaking, maybe, but does it really do you any good to keep thinking that way? Like, honestly, no, not really. It really doesn't. You having a possibility of getting cancer, like there's some goodness in thinking that way, as long as you can, constantly screen yourself, go for checkups every now and then, try to focus on your health, eat healthy, exercise, avoid carcinogens. But you can always randomly get it and get unlucky, and it wouldn't do you any good to just constantly believe that you're probably gonna get it. Like it just doesn't really do you any good. So in the same way that I don't just start assuming that the plane is gonna take a nosedive and crash and kill everybody when I get on an airplane, or that I'm going to suddenly come down with some sort of insane illness that was extinct for the past several centuries. Who knows? Like, anything can happen, but it does you good to have some reasonable set of faith, which is like to assume that the fabric for my clothing isn't seeping into my bloodstream and going to cause a problem. I can't scientifically prove that to you right now. The best I can do is heuristically tell you I've worn this shirt thousands of times before. That's not going to happen. But even then, who's to say that this isn't the first time? Well, I'm to say it because you were to say it too. Most of us would agree there's not really any sense in just believing it's going to hurt me. So that's kind of how I use pragmaticism to look at the real world. Like it doesn't really bother me, even when it comes to the more spiritual components of my life, where I'm driven to tears through like art. There's something happening there, but in my mind, it's not so much that it's just some. You can break it down like here. You can probably psychoanalyze why this sort of like the way that I'm viewing this story or this music, is causing these neurons to fire off in a way that make me want to cry. You can probably explain that to some degree, but I can't. We can't explain all of it yet, if ever. There's some stuff that moves us in ways that we don't understand. Like just, you can break down the reasons Cereza means so much to you, or Bayonetta, but there might be some things that stuck out to you, like you like the way she looks, you like the way she does, and we can't really explain all of the reasons. It still moves us though. That's why I think art's important, because it's as if there's some truth in that maybe someday science will be strong enough to uncover for us. But even though it's not now, it's more than just a biological process to me, because I believe there might be something metaphysical out there, or there might be some other source of understanding, and that's kind of exciting. So it's a little bit of a ramble, but the reason that pragmaticism stuck out is because it kind of works for me in every capacity, not just scientifically, but it kind of helps me make sense of the reason that I feel so strongly about certain music or art. Um, and I can use it effectively when it comes to understanding, you know, the difference in political opponents. Like that's how I kind of uncover that Trump is lying about something, is through pragmatism. It's not just as merely like I take one person's word over his. It's I look at all of the sets of facts all together, and they all point towards one sort of thing. And if you apply that same philosophy, philosophy heuristically to some other idea, it works just the same. If you look at all the facts and kind of form a conclusion best you can, while knowing that it's possible the more information you get might give you a new conclusion, that same mental system you're using of pragmatism would work with uncovering someday a cure for cancer, or the better understanding of gravity, or why bloodletting isn't what we thought it was, and why the antibiotics are better. That's what creates technology and computers and the stuff that we're using to make our lives better. So to say that pragmatism is something's true is whatever is useful, it's kind of like not really the way that I would put it. It just so happens that truth is often useful, because it's something that we should be trying to strive for. Um, yeah, that's how I kind of view pragmatism. But how do you go about like this, the deciding if something's true? Like you've looked through facts to form your opinions on who to vote for, or what you believe about whatever you land on science or religion or whatever. How do you decide something is true personally?
That's a really great question. I think that's the right one to ask. But before I answer it, I do want to speak to two of the
Oh
things
yeah,
that
of
you
course.
laid out laid out there. One, um, I'm thinking about I can't remember the exact quote of this, but like um, Plato, on some level, I believe, thought that art was a little bit silly because it was a poor attempt of humans to sort of recreate the substance, the sort of the perfection, the perfect forms that we're all just shadows against this flame, and we're trying to attempt to recreate that with art, but like, and it's just silly. We can't do it, so we might as well forget about it and just be who we are. And okay, like, but no, I actually do think that art very much uh, is able to, because look, we have our limbic system before we have our neocortex. Primacy dictates, just like the brain stuff comes before emotions, regulating breathing and such. Our emotions come before our ability to abstract and to think logically. And I think that art is able to communicate ideas, themes, values, sentiments in a more holistic way than an essay could. As much as I enjoy writing essays,
Hmm.
um, you watch something like Neon Genesis Evangelion, and there is so much packed into that. But it's not this manuscript about humanity and human nature and
Still need to watch
existentialism.
that movie.
Oh, you should. You really should. Um, there's so much packed in there, but it's not this manuscript. But you're able to feel it and interpret and think about it in ways because of the scenarios that you're presented with that these characters are engaged in and have to deal with and process. And I think that that is really, it's just fascinating to consider that because, um, yes, like some things can just only best be communicated in that form, and it's hard to actually just extract abstractly and write about it in an analysis. So that just aspect of truth, I think, is really fascinating, and I think it's real, and it sort of speaks to how part of when we're talking about truth as far as what concerns humans, some of it is about what feels, rather than what ones and zeros
Yeah.
measurements and such. The other thing I wanted to mention as we were talking about quantum mechanics, yeah, it's about patterns and it's about like the tendencies. Like it
Mhm.
could be this, but it also could be that. But if you measure it, it's only going to be one thing. But it could be also other things all at the same time. This idea that you have the photon, the particle, but also it's the wave at the same time, right? The duality. And so um, it's very brain breaking. Um, and I actually believe, not to derail this subject to the future of humanity, but like, I don't really think like there's going to be another Einstein that could close the gap on further us comprehending
Mm.
quantum mechanics. I actually think it's going to be artificial general intelligence running on quantum computing
Yeah.
that's going to be able to actually sort of. I just for all the things that you laid out, it's that is not what we observe in the macroscopic world, and yet we all are made up of particles, aspects of the microscopic world that do behave in this quantum manner of patterns and tendencies. And uh, yes, we may not perceptually be able to see that in the way that we sense and perceive the world, but that doesn't deny the fact that it is playing a role. Um, and it'll be really curious to see if someone unlocks all the full potential or some technology unlocks all the full potential about how the world is interconnected and what you can do through quantum.
Hmm.
But I just don't think a human's going to crack it. I don't think
Yeah.
we have the capacity. I think we need to create that godlike machine that can do it for us. I
Are
don't.
you afraid of AI,
ChatGPT
or
figured it
like
out.
are you
What was it?
are you concerned with AI and like what it might mean for humanity, or are you optimistic about it?
I so there's obviously plenty of reason to be concerned if you consume science fiction or if you play a certain third game of a certain trilogy. Uh, um, but there's also reason to be hopeful, and I think the interesting fact is that so there's actually this book. I love it. It's 12 Bytes by Jeanette Winterson. It's a collection of 12 different essays, and I think it is wonderful. Anyone wants to know more about how we arrived in this moment, technologically speaking, and where we might be going, this is the best book to sort of
Hmm.
dive into that. I've listened to tons of authors go on podcasts and do interviews, and I'm like, oh, that's a great man idea. I don't need to buy your book. This I heard this interview. I was squealing in the car like a small kid. I was like, oh my God, I have to buy this book. And it did not disappoint at all. So
Okay.
very fantastic. And she lays out a really interesting case about how um, like we have to like kind of step back and think about the power of narrative and how that sort of affects the way that individuals operate and societies operate. And we've been telling ourselves some old stories for a long time that don't actually really work. But artificial general intelligence, like it's going to understand intuitively how everything actually is interconnected and interrelated and how change is working and whatnot. And um, depending on the real threat is the humans behind it because at some point like we fully control it and at some point it becomes sentient itself,
Hmm.
but in the intermediate it's like what happens along that progression, and do the wrong people use it in wrong ways and it goes terribly. But they were making this case that it's going to be Buddhist and understand how everything is connected, and it's not going to sort of feel any sort of emotional tug of preserving old failed narratives because they'll see that they clearly don't work. You don't need the sort of disparities and inequality that exist in the world. This is all superfluous, and we can do this, and this is how we will solve climate, and blah blah blah. And so um, it's a really big idea, and she lays it out across multiple essays in the book. But I think that there is reason to believe. Okay, well, yeah, we don't know how it's ultimately going to play out. There's lots of different key moments that are going to shape this whole thing, this fundamental, huge foundational moment in human history, perhaps arguably our next evolution. There's going to be lots of things that shape it, and we won't know how it ends until it ends. But there's at least reason to believe there's like a coherent theory of the case of how this doesn't have to actually end terribly. So I've went from freaking out to like, you know what, we'll figure it out. And
Hmm.
if we don't figure it out and we die, well, we're dead. But I'm not going to worry about it until it happens, because we could figure it out. But yeah, so but reeling it back in a bit, yeah, I think just trying to understand tendencies and that things could be one thing, like it speaks to the conditionality of truth, and which gets to your whole broader point about pragmatism, about how what could be true now or in this moment, like that's helpful, but it could change at some point, and that's like something that you have to contend with, and it's difficult to sort of, it makes it very challenging to be able to say this is what truth is, because you have to sort of respect that fact that things are changing, and conditions are shifting. Everything's always changing, and everything's interrelated. So, and for all these, as we're entangled, all these forces are interacting on things. It's like you're going to see tendencies and patterns of things for some periods of time, but that might not ultimately always be forever and always the truth. Like, how universal could it actually be? And so when you ask me the question of how do I think about using pragmatism to figure out what is true, I mean, I would agree with you. I also am really sort of looking at what in the world can we point to that is helpful for explaining what is going on, why it's going on, and useful in sort of making your own decisions. Because in a certain sense, like, yes, you're like outsourcing the effectiveness of of truth, as sort of the judgment for whether it's still true in this moment. Like,
Hmm.
I'm gonna keep following this set of procedures to reach this goal, so long as I think I'm actually making progress to that goal. And that, you would argue, would be true. But like, if the conditions change and that's no longer yielding that outcome, it's no longer true, right? And I mean, maybe that speaks to like different theories of diet, right? Like, and it seems like it's quote unquote true. And you could maybe have this sort of possibly pedantic, but
Yeah.
possibly fair argument about, well, was it ever true to begin with? And maybe the answer probably is no. But at least from a user experience perspective, like, I think that's sort of helpful. Like, in that moment, okay, this seems to be true, and knowledge and wisdom, they all evolve over time as things continue to change, and we also have more time to learn more. And I think that I think it's okay to accept that, again, because when we think about universality of truth, it's not just all possible conditions in a given moment. It's also about across any given moment, like not just this given moment, but other moments. And it's really difficult to find things that span both of those dimensions in large quantities. Some things are really true right now in a lot of different scenarios, but they're not going to actually be true in a lot of scenarios later in the future. Whether we're talking about sociological trends, or um, what seems to be realities of human nature, or, I mean, to your point earlier, like, but one of the tricky things about this is there's also some things that you think are true, but they're not actually true, like bloodletting. Like, that was never helpful, but it was believed to be helpful for some time, and so it's important to like distinguish that is separate from things that actually were true for a given period of time and are no longer true. Like, for example, this is helpful for preserving this habitat
Right.
for this kind of species, and then now climate change has occurred, and that those tactics are no longer going to be helpful because the average global temperature has shifted, sea levels have risen, and there's precipitation trends are different in the same places than they used to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like that, those are real conditions shifting, and that's like real. You can actually point to things to explain why something was true once and is
Right.
no longer true.
Yeah. So like what? So you, it's interesting how you make this about time a little bit. You bring time into this to say that it's something. It has to be. It's rare for something to be true in both dimensions, right? On both sides of the time. But like if you're so how kind of having a hard time articulating this. If you look at truth as a culmination of a bunch of set of facts, like how do you existentially handle understanding what each fact is? Like maybe it's better if I make this a bit more personal. Like so, I had a bit of an existential crisis for quite some time. Like not really following a certain religion and just kind of feeling alone and feeling like when I would go to someone for questions like how do you make sense of the world? How do you view this? And they would give me an answer that I think is ridiculous or really bad. Then it's like okay, well then I don't want to go for you for advice anymore. But then I don't know who to go. It's kind of like this. It's like Jordan Peterson. It's like Jordan Peterson's really helpful and gives some good advice, like, and some that seems so straightforward, like clean your room, like lift your head up. The world's tough, but you can take it. Like that kind of mentality. It's like there's some truth in there, and it's like that's kind of cool. But then when he goes down, a conservative escapade, I don't know if that's the right term, but whatever I don't know if I'd call
Rabbit
it a
hole.
grift or not, but he
Yeah.
went down that conservative rabbit hole, and he's kind of frozen. It feels like he's frozen in that category, like you said. What's that expression, by the way? Just frozen, something frozen.
Oh, epistemic seizing and freezing.
Yeah, epistemically he is seasoning and freezing. I think that he's frozen where he's at, and that like it feels like okay, I've lost some respect by default, and I don't want to, but I just have. And it's like how do I now? I don't know how to handle that, and like I would say that his biggest like respectful like opponent or adversary was probably someone like Sam Harris,
Mhm.
who I would align with a bit more closely now, at least in terms of the cultural and philosophical discussions. But I didn't really. It kind of feels like it kind of reminds me of that human need to have someone to put your faith in. That's probably why there's so many religions, and it's so inherent to do that. It's like here's how I think of it. Like here's a takeaway from what I got from what you were just telling me. You you have a little bit of faith in the future of humanity. Like, you know what, we'll probably figure it out. Like, yeah, as much as all there's doom and gloom, the more you like look at stuff, like you might feel kind of pessimistic, like there's no hope for humanity. And especially the talking, like every time we get this past election has been so depressing. Like everyone's just nothing but cynical, you know. Um, so it's nice to think that there might be some hope for the future of humanity, especially the distant future. But I've gone back and forth of feeling that way, like, oh, I don't know if I should feel happy or optimistic about it, but I want to. But you seem to have come to the same conclusion I did. I felt really sad when I was going through that existential crisis. Like, how do I handle this? Like, are we gonna survive? Like, we're gonna have the heat death of the universe eventually. Like, all of this will be for nothing. Like, how do I handle that kind of thought? But the way that I did it was thinking, like, you know what? Like, I don't know that for sure. Like
Mhm.
we have reshaped our understanding of reality so many times as it is that yeah, that might be the trajectory we're going, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will stay that way forever. It doesn't mean that way, or it doesn't mean that, and that has kind of given me a sense of faith. It's ironically, it's through my further understanding of the science, as limited as it still is, the more that I go, the further that I go into my research and studying, the more optimism that I have for humanity. Like we're doing a pretty good job of learning it, and it makes me all the more ideologically frustrated with that kind of MAGA movement that is so comfortable just being stuck where they're at. It doesn't even have to just be MAGA. I should be empathetic to people, but it's just really any strong ideological I don't want to say grift, but just framework that you can subscribe to. Anything that you sort of that just takes hold of you that you can follow with such strong conviction, like a religion or a political affiliation, whatever it might be. Like people that are stuck to that, it's really hard to get them out of it. Once you go down that, that's the reason it's hard. You have to play whack a mole with the MAGA dude. It can be that way with anybody of any ideology. It just so happens that some are more powerful, so it's harder to get out of them. Um, yeah, I forgot where I was going with that. My brain's getting fried.
No, no, this is good though. But I think you were trying to make the point of um, like it was interesting that I was speaking to this idea of like conditionality to
Right.
what is true and isn't, but like that might sort of have an impact about someone like you existentially about
Mhm.
what this means for all of us. And I
Right.
think what you were getting at was this idea that like actually a lack of certainty is like liberating. It's
Hmm.
empowering because like be humble about your caveats, right? Like oh well if this happens and this happens and this it's going to be disastrous. Okay, well let's hope that not all of those if the caveats like actually
Yeah.
happen in the way that we're laying it out. We don't know, and that's the beautiful thing about life is that you can go live your life. It's not all you can't just it's all figured out on paper. No, it's not. Live it. Do
Hmm.
it. Be what you want to be. Um, take charge of your own story and write it in the direction that you want. Don't accept the other stories that people have pushed onto you. It doesn't have to be that way. And that's the real power of humanity, that we don't have to wait for evolution to change our stories. We are not some rabbit or bear or whatever, some animal that, okay, well, I suck in these scenarios, I excel in these ones. I hope I get it right in my life, but my species ain't changing until maybe evolution at some point. We can change our own stories. We have the capacity to do that because of our intelligence and also our capacity for love. Um, we can change things. We can appreciate things. We can learn from it, and that's a wonderful thing. And so, but as thinking beings and who are self-aware, we're anxious quite a bit because we think, well, things might not turn out well, but you just don't know. And
Yeah.
so, I think leaning into that lack of certainty is not just liberating and empowering, but it also I think it's just more honest. Like you have to, it's humility. Like we only know what we do know, and that's a lot, but like it's not everything.
Totally, yeah, and like I think it's totally true to say it's liberating. It's like it's exciting in a way to know that there's more to learn and discover. If you knew everything, life would be kind of boring in some way. It's the reason that you
Yeah,
don't like spoilers in movies. Like you want to discover it on the journey on your own. You don't want to just be told how it ends at the beginning. Otherwise, there's no point in going through that journey. That's the whole point of it. The journey is not the destination, or like the you get the saying. What the I don't know what the metaphor is, but it's
no,
the
you're right. The journey is not the destination; it's the or the whole. It's
It's like
yeah.
like what you're looking at. Yeah,
We
we're
both
both losing it. The point is like we both know that's true, even though we can't recite it perfectly because it just feels something. It resonates within our hearts. It's like it's about the
yeah,
journey along the way than it is the actual destination. The goal should be like how you grow along the journey rather than getting there. Um,
exactly.
and I think that's so true. And we know that inherently and intuitively, most effectively through stories. And I think that's the utility in it. And that's why, and I definitely will be writing about this extensively and throughout all of my Substack, which is this merging of um, stories and fiction with nonfiction, with reality, that we have to have some sort of like combination of these, or not necessarily a combination because it can get dicey and you can conflate what is what. But as long as we understand what is fiction versus nonfiction, I think they should be working together rather than just on their own separate islands because there's a way that's where the art form comes in. Like the stuff that we can't really understand, we understand it through non-scientific means, through art, through music, through stories. I think that's what's most powerful. That's
And you know who was a big proponent of that, by the way?
Jordan Peterson.
Oh well, maybe. But Albert Einstein.
Oh,
Like
really?
think about it. The last guy who made this big leap for us and our theories, understanding of the way that the world works, allowing us to sort of finally have physics validate what was intuitive wisdom long ago about relativity and quantum mechanics, was a big proponent of children reading fantasy and engrossing in fiction and fostering their curiosity and their imagination. Um, Not just, oh, let them do STEM. right?
Right.
Like he thought that was super important, and I think that that is sort of indicative of my thesis on that, of this idea that, like, yes, there is a space for intuitive wisdom, and because there are things that we could think of and feel to be true, even if we don't have the tools to prove it. Because eventually we could do it, but like you have to think of something to even test it. Like you can't do the scientific method if you haven't made the
Right.
conjecture. And you have to be able to think beyond the knowable to really challenge our limitations of what we know. And if you really get steeped up in everything that we do know, then you might be afraid to challenge some of the walls that we've erected about our limitations of what we think is world defining. Maybe that wall is fake. Maybe if you puffed on it like the bad wolf, it would just fall over, right? And he certainly did, and he was an advocate for it. And I think so. To your point, I really do think fiction and nonfiction together are foundational for humans to understand the world, because we're not just our neocortexes and we're not just our limbic systems. We're both of them,
Hmm.
and story can communicate things, big ideas, old ideas, in ways that you can't necessarily as easily or at all get across in an essay.
Totally. I definitely agree. That I think we're on the same page there. I just get concerned with. It feels like I think that's. I think most people kind of recognize the power of story. You know, there's people out there that are a little bit less sensitive to that kind of emotional stimulation, or at least they don't show that, or they don't let themselves be so vulnerable. But even as closed off as people can be, everyone kind of inherently understands the importance and significance of story in art forms. I think that there is a significant problem, at least in this country, at least with half of it, with a beyond just a lack of faith in our institutions. It's like maybe it is stemming just from that lack of faith in our institutions, but whatever it is, it's leading people to start to not value truth as much as they should, and instead it's just the vibes. It's what makes them comfortable. Um, I get concerned with that, but do you think that might change later? Like, do you think that we're gonna have the same problem like next? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm discouraged. Like to this day, people don't believe that people to this day don't believe the last election results. They believe that Trump won in 2020. There's still people that still believe that to this day. Like, how do you wrestle with that moving forward? Like, do you think these people will someday learn that's not true? Should we just give up on that? Are we allowed to give up on that? Don't we need the other half of the country to survive? Like, what do you think about all that? Kind of blurring all of these discussions back towards this election and the results of it. Like, what do you make of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question. Look, there were some people who, in the wake of this outcome, were like, huh, well, conspiracy theorists, how do you explain this outcome? Clearly they couldn't rig it again, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I have seen them. They have tried to explain it. I've read the tweets, I've
Yep.
read the replies, and I I have to I have to admit I was a little guilty of thinking, well, I don't think they could explain this one away. Oh no, they did. Which is why it's important to, I think, really remember that information is downstream of trust. Um, and for people trying to understand the world and make decisions about it, like truth is downstream of trust as well. Because like truth is a subset of information, and I believe all information is just downstream of that in the way that people interact with it, except for people like you and I who, but even then, we all have our internal
Yes.
biases.
Right.
That sort of, so while I, like you in your earlier statement, agreed with, like, I have an open mind. If people present the information, they make the case. Like I will consider it, and I could be persuaded. I'm a good faith participant in conversation. Um, it's like I still think even for us, we are not exceptional. I think trust though, like because I mean, someone could present information about um, like okay, they're a flat earther and they're a moon lander, and they're a Sandy Hooker, and then they go and now there's some new thing, and it's we've not encountered it before. but are you and I going to actually really give them the fairest hearing that we might have otherwise given all the? Probably not. Even though the information is the information, and probably look, I mean, given if those all four things are true, the information's probably faulty. But like, and you could probably, so it's hard to sometimes separate. But I do think that is example enough to prove about how it's downstream. But anyways, to your point, yeah, I don't think you can give up on everyone. But I also think like this was so earlier in my interest in politics and everything, I wanted to make sense of it all, but I also felt like a real sense of imperative. Like this is important,
Hmm.
and everyone should be doing the role that they can do. And I still feel that way, and that's part of why I'm writing this so that people realize that everyone plays a role in this and they need to do what they need to do to help this. But um, but one of the interesting things in all of that was, as I was thinking about it much earlier, was this idea of like, well, how do you persuade? What is persuade? Because I'm a marketer by trade, and so I wanted to understand persuasion. I thought this would be a helpful subject to inform me of that, in addition to what I was learning elsewhere, more formally. And the fact that I came to, like, you just can't win them all. Be logically possessed, whether it be of the left or the right. Like, they have to let themselves come off of that. There's a lot of people who look and sound similar to those people, but they're not actually truly ideologically possessed. They're not truly captured by some sort of ideology. They're just repeating what is said
Mm.
in a group, and they're hearing these things. But those people are persuadable, and in a democracy, that's enough. If polarization, despite how polarized we are, if it was such significant swaths of the country weren't actually, um, it'd be one thing else. But like, I
I'm sorry.
think,
Can you just repeat that last sentence because my connection staggered a little bit.
oh, you're good. Yeah, if significant swaths of the country were, um, these people are not persuadable or movable. And yes, in some ways, it kind of looks that way. But like, also, like, think about all of the places that Kamala Harris herself, and oh, I never said this earlier, but I just briefly, I wanted to agree with you. Yeah, I think, like I mentioned earlier about how much Biden had made mistakes on trust. Like, I wanted to make sure I got across mistakes herself, but it was that the environment had been so soiled that I don't believe
Yeah.
even her fixing her mistakes would that have made a difference. But
Mm.
anyways, but so uh, the there were so many places that she didn't win that Democratic issues or candidates also won while they voted for Trump. There were voters who, after the fact, in focus groups, explained uh, women's rights do matter to me, and bodily autonomy does matter to me. I also am frustrated by the fact that I can't buy a house or prices are too high. I trusted Trump with that federalism on abortion, and I voted for candidates down ballot or issues down ballot because there was this abortion on, like, that made me feel more comfortable
Mm.
that I could pick what he may or may not think, and he's changed his position. These people, and that was sort of like they were comfortable, pardon the metaphor given the subject, but splitting the baby that way. Um, and I think that what that speaks to is, again, it's folly to underestimate just how persuadable. After all, these parties, despite our polarization, have never been weaker in terms of their influence and
Yeah.
the alignment of Americans with them.
Yes.
There's never been more self-identified.
Yeah.
Most of them largely lean one way or another. They can be persuaded. I mean, else how would you explain how there was such a swing in blue states like New Jersey and New York
That's a good point. But
to the
what would you
Republican
say to
Party?
what would you say to people that say it's not so much that people were swun, but it's just that less people were activated than before? Like David Pakman has said that in the past. Like,
Oh, so it's about turnout versus
right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that because it's like a cynical view, right? Because it sort of assumes like people have to be this way, and they were just
I guess it
motivated
also
for what.
demonstrates if it's true, it demonstrates the
Yeah.
significance or how important it is to have a good candidate for that reason.
Well, yeah, because you want more favors in your, or excuse me, more conditions in your favor than not. Uh, but yeah, I guess yes, there are going to be some people who they're not persuadable, but you do have to motivate them to get off the couch. That is a factor in all of this. But I don't believe studying results and trends and what voters are actually saying in terms of how they square what will look like an ideologically inconsistent view or I think when you take the totality of all of that evidence, I think it's really hard to conclude that yes, like these hardcore ideological partisans, maybe they were running our discourse a lot over the last decade. The way that very authoritarian about discourse and what people were allowed to say, or the way that they were allowed to say it, and the right with all of its flooding of the zone with misinformation and how having to contend with all of these whataboutisms and sort of attacks on institutions. They made a lot, and everyone had to sort of play off of that. But they're very, I don't believe they're that large of the total population, particularly even of voters. Like, yes, part of the challenge of our system is that they, a lot of voters don't turn out for primaries, but the ideologically, and so that's part of why uh, get candidates that will win primaries but can't win the general election because of what they had to say to win their primary dream. Um, and I would like to see perhaps like more open primary systems or ability to for people to show up and choose from both parties or ranked choice voting, like different ways. I think that would be really helpful. There's obviously reasons why there's inertia on that front, but some states have explored some of that, and there as a result. But yeah, so it's I can understand why people would think it maybe has to come down to that because after all, if their experience from the last decade has been, oh God, it's Thanksgiving tomorrow, and as we're recording this, and I have to sit across the table from ex family members who I know are going to say these things and not listen to what I have to say about it. Like, um, yeah, it can feel dispiriting. Like we also take a step back. Are you being insane? Have you been trying the same thing for years on end? Should you maybe change your tactics, your approach? Should you try to listen more? I mean, because here's the deal. People will say, "Well, listen," but what is there to listen about? He's spouting off this conspiracy, or he's saying this racist. Ask yourself the question when he's saying that. Like, yes, if you're mostly focused on what is he going to say or how is he going to say it, you're that's actually more interesting and helpful. The why. Why is it that he doesn't trust other people or other institutions? Why is it that he feels this way about other people? And it might just be that he has some pain, he has some hurt, and he doesn't feel like anyone actually understands why that is, and why that has sort of sullied his view of humanity or the world or whatever institutions. Um, but if you actually listened and spoke to him in a way that communicated that you were listening and that you were curious as to why it was that he felt the way that he did, he might actually be more inclined to listen to you. But if you're just trying to go and have that fight, it's the blowback effect. Everyone retrenches
Hmm.
further into their beliefs, and they just sort of firm it up as they're trying to go dodge the blows and throw in their own. And I think listening and empathy is really through that. And so, yeah, if your personal experience has left you frustrated and you're wondering that, I think you might have to reevaluate your tactics because, and I'm not saying it's a panacea. Like it's not going to immediately work on and eventually work on everyone, but it'll work on more people than you would be willing to give it credit for, especially if you're feeling cynical. Um, People aren't born dark, depressed nihilists. But when they are flooded with pain in their life and they don't feel like they have enough support, some people just harden up and they think it's a and they get comfortable with some of those darker ideas or not trusting other people.
Mm,
It takes someone who claims that they're about empathy, deploying it with them,
mm,
bringing them into the fold
mm.
to actually undo that. The last thing that's going and trying to do moral purity test with them. So all of that is to say, I think I think there's a lot of reason to believe. Yeah, it's going to be hard. It's not easy. It's not instant. So wired for instant gratification in the smartphone era, but like, um, this is so real. Like, be real with these people. They're in your life. They're in family. Like, take the time and appreciate the fact that it took a while for them to get to that place, and it's probably going to take them a while if they're ever going to leave that place. But do you want to be the change in this world or not? And if you do, accept the while. But it also might surprise you if you're really effective. It might even happen sooner than you believe. Um, and if nothing else, we'll at least have conversations that we can actually enjoy because we're actually caring about what the other person's saying, not wondering, oh God, how do they see it that way? I can't believe.
Like, what do you? We're gonna have a Trump administration soon. Are you concerned about rollbacks on protections for minorities, like like such as homosexuals or anybody, any minority? Are you what would you say to someone that's really worried? Like if they're also gay and they worry, or maybe they're a woman and they worry about abortion or whatever. Like what do you say to the people that are really scared of the upcoming administration? How do you feel
Yeah.
personally?
I think that's an important question to ask. I'll admit, I mean, I did not vote for this guy in this election because there were a lot of things that were said, but you know, the economic analysis was clear. He's if he did what he said I don't want that to happen. I'm worried about what he would do geopolitically as far as Ukraine is concerned and
Mm-hmm.
the broader implications for Russia and all that. Like, there's a lot of things out there where I'm once the election happened and I really started thinking about like hours later, okay, this is about trust and we need to be humbled. Like the power of information is not that it's much weaker compared to trust. I'm like, okay, I really need to look. These people who voted for him, they said it was bluster. They said that it was just rhetoric. I'm hoping that they're right. I think people have reason to doubt it because that's what the past shows. But we need to we need to play it out. I think one thing that you are seeing now versus 8 years ago is that the resistance is not shouting and screaming and fighting at every turn. Part they're demoralized. They feel like they worked really hard for this and they came up short, and they're like confused at how people could actually vote this way. We've already talked about that portion of it, but like, I also think strategically, I think Democrats shouldn't resist everything full mast. I think because the trust concerns around that, like, if you resist everything with full vigor to just seem unreasonable. Like you're not trying to work with him on some things. And if you save it for the things that really do matter, people are more likely to hear you out because you're at least seeming like a team player, so to speak, about this democracy and society. So I think you'd be more effective for that. You just win more trust, which would be helpful for you in 4 years. Fact of the matter is that there's a big question like how many people are actually they're all talking about, well, we're going to start with who came here illegally, but like, what about people who came here illegally that aren't violent criminals? We're just going to have to find out. I mean, someone made the joke of the reason why there were more deportations under Obama than Trump is that deportations are hard and Trump is not good at, which, is a little bit humorous. But I mean, they're probably going to be more effective than they were previously. But And yeah, I mean, elections do have consequences, and some of it's not going to be pleasant. And I think, yeah, I mean, part of it is that there was a loss, and they do have power, and they're going to wield it. I mean, part of the reason why I think incumbents have lost the last three cycles in a row is in some regard to the idea that we've had much victories, but they overread the mandate and they govern like an ideologue when really they wanted small nudges in one direction versus the other. And so there is a good argument that it could blow back as soon as 2026. But the question is what happens between then and now. And ultimately, the fact is that yes, I think some people will be impacted. I don't believe I'm not as worried for myself personally, so it's easier for me to speak about this terms that are not um, mired in my own
Mm,
subjective feelings. But I will say, um, you have to wait until it happens. And if you are concerned about anything in specific, start coming up with your plans for it. Like, be prepared,
mm.
because it could happen, but it also might not. And if you're at least prepared, you'll have an ability to respond to it. You'll have an ability to be resilient about it. And also, if you're really concerned about how some issues are going to, you would like to make change in the world, consider what you can do in your community and around this issue rhetorically in the discourse in a way that brings more people into the fold and garners more trust around it. Like, how can you help push that forward? How can you bring more Americans to your perspective on this? There are no permanent victories in politics. Uh, yes, some things don't change very often, but it was the way it was in the Biden administration, and now it's going to change. You can win the next election and change it back, and if you do it the right, that political victory, because like gay marriage, or going anywhere. I mean, I know there were some rumblings from some people about it, but like still has a majority approval even amongst conservatives. So
Yeah.
sometimes you can win in a way that actually creates a lasting effect. And so, yeah, just either be prepared for your own sake or also start thinking about how you can actually drive the change that's going to effectively produce the outcome that's really important to you.
What do you so I notice that a lot of conservatives now are the ones saying that, we might disagree, but we can still be friends. And like actually that's kind of how it always has been. Republicans were always the kind like, the Ben Shapiros and even the Milo Yiannopoulos and those the most sensational to the most traditional. The conservatives that were out there commentating on politics were the ones getting shut down at a university, that were getting protests outside, and they ran on that. Like that fueled their movement. You're like, see, look at these people that don't want me to speak. They don't want me to share what I have to say. Why is that? That's sus, right? And that makes them look better. It makes them look like they're reasonable people that will talk to you, even though we disagree. And then you have people on the other side that scream and will just judge you for not understanding or not being educated, even. And then it creates a clear dichotomy for people that aren't really politically motivated to look at that from the outside and be like, by default, the people on the right seem more reasonable. I was always of the mind that, especially as an independent, someone that like wasn't had any I had no passion for politics, and I still don't enjoy it, despite that this podcast, at least this interview so far, is like primarily politics. It's really just kind of a coincidence. It's not that I have a passion for it, because I don't. But when I was before I had dived as deep as I have, before I dived so deep into it and learned as much as I did, I had that feeling too. Like the side seems a lot more like vitriolic and judgmental than the other does, ironically. And I always thought the conservatives should be more judgmental, because they're like the Christians typically. They're gonna have a lot of strong opinions on you if you're gay and what you do in the bedroom, you know. But now I see people like, what do you think of this? Um, I've been seeing posts on Instagram and stuff lately, and Twitter and Blue Sky, which I'm on, by the way. Blue Sky is like an alternative to Twitter now. It's actually quite nice. Um, there is people saying like, like mocking the people that are holding signs up. Like now it's really only the MAGA people that are saying we can disagree and still be friends. Everyone else is kind of like, no, we can't. Well, not everyone else, but I see people that say no, we can't. I was never one of those people, but I'm kind of in that camp right now. I don't know if you are or not, but that's where I'm at. Where I have family that I love and care about that have voted for Trump, and I have friends that are almost like former friends. Now, not all of them, because there's some that I think voted for them because they just don't know any better, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, but I'm just saying, like, I think if you knew everything that Trump did, you wouldn't have voted for him. I do think that's the case for most people, even people that in my family that are strong Trump supporters. I know this because when I ask them, "Would you vote for someone that did this?" They're like, "No." I'm like, "Well, Trump did it." I'm like, "Well, he probably had to," or you're taking it out of context. Like, there's always some cop out they have ready, but in their heart of hearts, if they're being honest with themselves, they would know that they wouldn't support someone like this. They're just too, like you said, they're ideologically frozen. They seize and freeze. So,
Mhm.
for that reason, I don't really even want to like. It's hard for me to like before I can put politics away and just have fun playing Smash with the homies, like, well, let's not talk about politics. Neither one of us know all the answers. Let's just agree that we both inherently want the same thing. We both want happiness and everyone to be at peace. We just disagree on how to get there. And we also don't really know how to get there. So let's just respect each other. But now it's like, to me, it's so obvious. Someone that was not politically involved at all. Now it's like fucking blatantly obvious that Trump is like he is not the guy that the MAGA people say he is. And like you know that because even the people on the left are more critical of the person they're voting for than the right ever has. Like people that voted for Biden hated Biden the whole time and didn't even like Kamala Harris. I was one of those people. Like I'm not really proud of who I'm voting for. It's just that the alternative is that bad. That's not really a good marketing tactic. You know what I mean? And but
Right.
the problem is that it feels deceitful to say no, Biden is all that great. It is the best, especially when you see him gaffing, not just in the debate, but even months prior to that, when the Democrats kept saying he was fine. Like he still had those slip ups, and it was obvious to me and apparently a lot of other people that something was going on. But all that being said, right now it's painfully obvious, that what's happening. It's you have people that are like getting millions of dollars from tenant media. Did I lose you, or did you hear that? People that are getting millions of dollars from tenant media to purport talking points that are contributing to an election. Um, so even if someone's acting in good faith, let's assume that someone's voting for someone knowing full well about Project 2025. Like, would you want to still be friends with someone like that? Like, how would you grapple with that? What do you make of all this?
Yeah. I think it's kind of like the question of the moment and the question of our times for the last decade. Like, who am I going to associate with? I obviously, I think a lot of people who are grappling with this, yourself included, are people who would be like, it's not like if this was about, okay, you prefer this policy and incrementally I prefer that policy. I don't care, per politics, I don't care that you have, we can be friends and we can agree to disagree and that's fine. But it's about values. It's
Yeah.
about fundamental
Yeah, it's
beliefs.
become deeper and more personal.
Oh, sorry. What was that?
It's become deeper and more personal, the politics
Yeah,
lately.
exactly, exactly. And um, I think that it's made this a lot more challenging than it would normally. And I did read actually the other day that someone was like a person in their 60s or so was talking. Look, back in the day, if you were a Vietnam draft dodger, like that broke relationships, and people were comfortable with that. There was none of this. "Oh, we need to still stay as friends and stuff like that." For some people, that was and indefensible, and for other people, it was indefensible that for it's such an unworthy cause. The in there and how we were conducting it, um, and I do think that there was a line. There were two things. I think so. For me, I think pushing people out of the fold obviously is not helpful for building trust that actually will uh, want to see. But I also think our life's too short to sign up for abuse. Like if someone in your life, a friend, a family member, or whatever, is constantly barraging you about politics in a way that feels abusive. You dread looking at their messages, and you're like, oh God, do we have to have this discussion again? Maybe you can save the relationship by really like taking a break from it, coming back and expressing like I want to be friends with you for these parts, but not that part, or like can you please understand my perspective and respect where I'm coming from at this? I'm trying to likewise reciprocate with you. Um, I think that there's a line there that if someone is just toxic, is your blood pressure, you don't owe them in your life because I would give that advice whether it was about politics or it wasn't. Where
Mm-hmm.
if it was about some other sort of topic, I think that's fine. But I also think we all need to talk, right? To your point about used to just be smashing with the homies, but now we talk about these things. We should talk about these things. That's
Mm-hmm.
what being a looks like. We talk about these things. Only an authoritarian things because the our dear leader has already decided for us, and dare you have any sort of contrary opinion, right? And that's not what we're in, and we shouldn't behave like the whole idea of never talk about religion or politics to me. I always thought was strange. I understand the religion thing to some extent because I think religion ultimately is about one's own interpretation, and it's not very much a debatable thing. Although there's ways to discuss and debate it, I'm sure. But politics, though, it's like we live in a like usually every year, if not multiple times every year. Like we have to make decisions. We're
Mm-hmm.
in this together. It affects us. It may not
Yeah.
affect us in the way that the birthday gift didn't come on time and the cake
Right.
didn't get baked well and your party sucks now. But like it's right in your face. But like it changes the world, shapes how we talk to each other. What's the culture? What this major cultural transformation, uh, hopefully in the right ways. Hopefully it's not cynical and us pulling further apart. Hopefully it's people realizing we need to come together. I mean, one of the great things is he's won this election. It's over. Like, assuming that they don't do any electoral chicanery in 4 years, he's going to walk away from this, and his whole personality that no one can quite emulate the way that he does it, is going to hopefully that's helpful and healing in a way, right? And so hopefully we can learn from this moment and grow together and sort of repair the trust bonds that his big personality exacerbated, although those lacking of trust was already there before him. He's a symptom and an accelerant, not a causal thing. Uh, but um, but everyone has to be able to do what is comfortable to them. I would also say to some people you voted against my rights or uh, my interest. How can I like on some level? I think there's a room for that to be okay. I also think on some level there should be self-awareness and introspection and challenging of yourself. Like, am I being fragile? Am I being the strongest person that I should be? Maybe it's not in this moment, and maybe it's something to strive for. But like, I also think like because that you can take that to an unhealthy like you either have to agree with me on everything, and there's a lot of people on the left and the right who feel that way, that they don't want to talk to anyone who doesn't fully agree with them, and you don't want to be that person. So I think that's what's challenging about this is that
Yeah.
you could be masochistically, I'm going to take everyone on and try to bring everyone into the fold no matter how detrimental it is to my and that's unhealthy, and you should draw lines around that. I'm not going to coddle myself. I can withstand the fact that people disagree with me about certain
Mm-hmm.
things, but it really comes down to how, if you try different tactics, how willing is the other person to sort of coalesce with it. But also, like, there are just certain personal values that, like, you can't cross, and that's fine, and that's partly what makes you you, and so it has to be your own decision. I probably bring more people into the fold for this election already because that's who I am and how I operate. And I've always thought that it was silly to push people out
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't think it yielded the right outcome. Um, but like I said earlier, maybe you identify that in self-reflection and it's not someone who you want to be, but you have to allow yourself the time to become able to be those that disagree with you, it might not be something you can immediately tolerate because if you try it, you might just get really frustrated and blow up. So it's deeply personal on a lot of different factors, and there are legitimate reasons to draw certain red lines on both ends of it. People are being cognizant and reflective and self-aware. Uh, I think that they can make the right choices on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Um, you had, like we talked earlier about how like in the before it always felt like the right wing always pushes for freedom of speech, right? Like you guys want to shut down our speech. You're the ones that won't let us speak at the colleges. We're the party of freedom of speech. Um, Lately, like as someone that was never really on the left, I was not involved in politics. I starting to talk about it when happening to disagree with a conservative idea. It's now only the conservatives that aren't talking to me. It's weird. Like I'm accused of forming an echo chamber right now by talking to another person that's liberal, someone that also doesn't like Donald Trump. But I'm willing to talk to a Trump supporter too. I've invited them onto the show as well, and they always deny it. And it's interesting how there's like it feels like there's a shift in that opinion because before it felt like it would be the total opposite of that. Um, it's weird. It's weird. Why do you think it is that that side doesn't want to engage with this discussion as much anymore? It feels like they've kind of formed their own totalitarian, authoritarian, like Trump is daddy. He's the answer to everything, or if, and they'll try to say like, well, I don't agree with Trump on everything, but then they'll give you one little tiny thing like, oh, he said this stupid thing. It's like, okay, but do you agree with his tariff policy? Do you agree with his immigration policy? Do you agree with this decision? Do you agree with this cabinet appointee? And usually you'll notice they don't really have a lot of the facts laid out because they're big picture people. I wonder if it's that they're just afraid of facing the facts, and that's why they always say like, oh, who does the fact checking, right? They're just like you're just listening to fake news. Um, but yeah, it feels like that. Tell me if you disagree with this, but in my opinion, it seems like it's the right that's the least engaged in this conversation now. You know?
Yeah, I think that that is actually fascinating because for me, obviously, and you agree with this, it's ideological extremists on both sides are not really curious about um, having broad, open discussions with different people. Like the more ideologically extreme you are, like definitionally, you're going to be less interested in
Yes,
discussing with people who don't
that's true.
agree with
And so
you.
it's less MAGA
And
and maybe it's more extremism.
yeah, I think that that's what it is. And I think you were right to sort of observe earlier that, particularly around Democratic Party politicians, like, on which kinds of activists we're talking about, but like the politicians, though, they have been a lot more self-critical and demonstrating the kinds of traits that you would want to see. It's not just the sort of cult of personality that you're seeing with Trump. Yeah, it's like it's I'm this is who my people are. And yeah, I maybe personally didn't like this one thing that Trump did, but I still trust him. And also, this is what and family are saying, or maybe just online community, right? Like, but that's who they are connected with, and so you're like brushing up against that, even though on the surface you think you're just asking honest, open questions about, okay, but what do you, given that this cabinet nominee has said these things, like, what do you think about that? And for them, it's just they're put on the defensive because you have not already demonstrated, and so this is like in-group, out-group conflict now. And I think that's unfortunate, but I think that is sort of what you're getting at when you're seeing those kinds of interactions, which is sad. But it's also interesting and ironic because, as you mentioned earlier, in a lot of ways, more rhetorically, the right was more willing to sort of, oh, well, the left is trying to tell us what is and isn't, and they're the ones that are being authoritarian
Yeah,
about
they're the cancel culture
culture.
party and we're the free speech party.
And yet, some of them aren't willing to sort of have that kind of conversation. But I think like that's just more of the fringe. And that's why you're able to see that dichotomy. I think the fringier you get, the less willing you're able to talk to other. But there are plenty of figures cultural and political on the right that are willing to have those conversations.
Is there anything that you want to ask me or like ask me about or mention while I think of that?
Yeah, so you mentioned that we would talk about this on the podcast, and maybe you alluded to it earlier when you briefly mentioned the heuristic a la your
Mm.
shirt and or anything. But yeah, I was just curious. And by the way, this has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Likewise.
Very much enjoyed it. And I could flip the script in the table for hours and ask you
Mhm.
questions. But in the interest of time, since this has gone on for quite a long enough, we'll have. But I will ask one question. What was that heuristic? Because obviously, you wanted to develop this heuristic for a concept of truth. And we earlier in the conversation about sort of my didn't give you the cleanest answer, but I think there was a lot of truth in all of the money nuances that we waded through.
Yeah,
So I hope that that at least was
it
helpful.
was.
But
Yeah.
I agree, you do have to have a concept of truth probably to
Hmm.
make a heuristic of. Or are you aiming to develop with your cohort?
So just so you're aware, like because there's like it seems like a little of a connection issue, like you cut out here and there. So if I'm not answering the question that you did ask, I heard most of it, but if I'm not answering you, just interrupt me and let me know that it's not the question you asked. But
Very cool.
the we actually never really got around to making a heuristic. That was what initiated this entire thing. Was him ask my cousin approached me and asked to come up with a heuristic that we can give to our younger siblings and nephews and stuff like that, our relatives that we could pass on, something that we would have faith in and pride in to say that this heuristic is a pretty strong one. It'll get you to the truth best as possible. Like, well, when we talked about that, like, okay, that sounds fun. We can do that. But at first he's like, well, first we have to figure out what truth even is. And like we talked about earlier, that sounds obvious and intuitive. And I just said, oh, it's just a fact that can't be denied or something that everyone, something like that. And then he was like, well, there's different concepts of truth. And then I went, you know, that whole fiasco. Um, because we ended up debating so much on the nature of truth, we never even got around to getting to that heuristic. Um, and that person has since like not really wanted to come on the podcast. But what I think would have happened if we were able to dive deeper into that and come up with a heuristic, and maybe we can come up with some together at some point, or like share ideas of what some are some good ones. Um, but I think it would have just been something that I think essentially pragmaticism would kind of be my heuristic. I think I kind of look at the lens I look at the world through that lens because it seems to work so good up until I get something better. Um, because what's special about pragmaticism is that it's not really a definition or description of truth so much as it is about the justifications for truth and the best methods of how to approximate truth, which is what a heuristic is. And pragmatism has that built into it. It states that truth, if it even is a real thing that exists, it's something that you can't see. It's out of our dimensional uh, lens. We can't look at it. We can't. There's no way that we can actually detect it or understand it. But we can approximate it or get as close as possible, and we'll just call that approximation truth because it's the closest we can get to it. But it's possible that actual truth is something else. So in a way, you can view pragmatism as like I'm I'm assuming that truth is this objective real thing that I just can't see. Or you can view pragmatism as to say that truth is not even really real. It's just what we kind of derive it to be. And we should decide that truth is what is the most rigorously tested thing. That's the best way to do it. That's what you can look at pragmatism in either way. And it kind of works in either scenario. Whether you assume truth is real or not, you can approximate it nonetheless very effectively through pragmatism. And that in itself is a sort of heuristic where you look at things through empiricism and testing and scientific inquiry. You can look at the whole world that way, and it would even work. And I'm going to write about this in the next article. Like, you can even justify it to argue a strong case through pragmatism why a concept like the eye for an eye isn't as good as something like the golden rule, or maybe something even better than the golden rule. Just kind of having a sense of peace, and because if everyone did think an eye for an eye, then everyone would be dead. Be dead. It'd be like nuclear warfare, or it'd be um, everyone just everyone pokes their eyes out, then no one can see anymore, you know? And unless we disagree on what outcome we want, right? Unless there's some psychopath out there that wants everybody to die and not live, then we can agree that um, we can agree that since we want peace to survive, we don't want it to devolve into chaos with everyone stabbing each other's eyes out. Pragmatism can tell you that it's less likely for that to happen if we don't live by that principle or that moral code and instead live by something like turn the other cheek. If everyone thought that way, we would objectively have a more safe environment, right? That's a very simplified way of demonstrating the utility behind pragmatism, not just in how it describes truth, but also in how it's employed heuristically. So I'd say that it's kind of a cop out, and I don't know that this is the right answer, and I'm still relatively ignorant when it comes to. I consider myself very ignorant when it comes to philosophy and everything. I haven't gotten the degree in philosophy or anything. So maybe there's a better understanding to be had, but for now, my heuristic is kind of just pragmatism. It's just that's the best shortcut I think to getting truth because I might not have tested in fact that you are the Cereza that I've been DMing on Discord, but through pragmatism, it's really unlikely that you're just some psychopath that killed him before you caught on here and then took his identity. You know what I mean? And I'm comfortable. I'm confident in saying that. I say that with faith because through pragmatism. So hopefully that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I that really does. And I think what it speaks to, the fact that you don't have necessarily a fully fleshed out heuristic or in the way maybe you had originally intended it. Like and the way that you're relying, because I also very much, it's not just that politically I think of myself as a pragmatist. The whole pragmatism theory for what is truth, like it just makes sense because of the whole conditionality of what how how conditionality can define truth based on uh, the factors at play now and also different instances of time and how things change. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like it's really hard unless you were like a god or I don't know the entity running the simulation if you believe that we're in a simulation, you know, it's very hard unless you're like outside of all of this and you do have you are omniscient, you do know everything. It's very hard to actually be able to declare this is universally true or forever and always. It's just it is constantly if if change is constant, I think it's fair to assume that that applies to truth as well. That truth is like even if something is more universally true, like it is going to have to stand against scrutiny from other ways of interpreting what would be true or not true to answer that whatever given question. Like it is consistently true across these things despite other like so it's just if change is constant, truth continually has to prove itself. And I think pragmatism and that framework and that theory is really, really helpful for sort of going out that and appreciating that rather than because otherwise, I mean, think about it. There's like a lot of other ways that people have tried to think about and theorize truth. Um, and think of how many big sort of this is how we understand the world to believe, whether it was that we were geocentric versus heliocentric or a whole host of sort of debates and they get overturned. I mean, hell, even in the pandemic, right? People were more concerned about it spraying through aerosols or whatnot.
Mm.
When it was less about individual drop. Do you have oh, I forget the word, but like airflow and filters and which is part of why like in India there are like holes in some of the roofs of some of the houses in parts of the country that allowed the sort of virus to air out and they weren't as impacted by that. But like people who don't have good homesick and they isolate in a room sometimes because it you know it ventilation, that's the word, yeah, ventilation was really a lot more important that but we didn't realize that early on. I mean how the original about masks like no let's leave them. No, wait, actually, you guys need them, right? Like it's just like
Yeah.
things evolve, like our
Sure.
understanding evolves, and I think more like I think other schools have thought about what is and is attempting to sort of declare once and for all, this is what is true, and or they lean in more in that direction, and I just think it's folly because change is constant, and what see of our perceptuary systems, we're all interrelated and dynamically so. So yeah, it's like it maybe feels like a cop out, but like the theory might just be the heuristic because it is when you really think about like because you asked me earlier like how do I think about determining what is and isn't true. I mean, I'm looking to journalists who do the sourcing or the scientists who take the measurements and then try to replicate the results of the other study. Like I'm trying to be a smart concept or skeptic consumer of information and media and trying to sort of question and challenge it in my own ways in my own head to up to scrutiny. It's more true or it's more accurate as a result, right? Like, but like these are all the best things that we can do because we are not omniscient beings who know all and can declare that it is such with certainty.
Right.
And again, it's a good thing that we don't have certainty. So yeah, it's like it's interesting to hear you say that that is sort of how you do deal with it because I just think it respects the conditionality of truth to a far greater degree than the other theories. And I mean, that's why we've had so many big overturning of past with more certainty than we should.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's possible that I might be, like I said earlier, I'm trying to have a big disclaimer and what's the term? I want to have the humility to say that I might be misinterpreting. Like I haven't read all of the writings from Charles S. Pierce, or everything there is to learn about pragmatism or all of the different theories and concepts of truth. So if there's anybody that has a philosophy degree that is just like cringing at saying like, oh, he's describing it wrong, then let me know. But based on my descriptions, I'm really confident in how I see it. Um, and I think that explains like how I can fall into like how that would apply into the political landscape as well as the moral landscape. Like the example I gave with an eye for an eye, I think you can rationalize why that's not a good idea. But yeah, Cereza, this has been a fantastic conversation. Any parting words or thoughts for me before we dip?
Well, thank you for having me. This has been really fun. I looked forward to this a lot, and I look forward to talk with you and to read your Substack and uh, or we could just VC as friends.
Mm.
And I'm bring on to this and how where this goes and where your journey on this subject goes, as well as what more pieces I might end up writing about trust and how that might be helpful to you eventually too. So we're on some really interesting intellectual journeys, and I'm very happy that we've intersected and that we can share in our companionship on our journeys about this very fascinating subject.
Yeah. Well, ditto, man. Same to you. Thanks so much. Um, and thanks for everyone for listening. It's been a great conversation. I'm sure we'll do it again. Hey, it's D Silverwolf here. If you want to listen to more of this irresistibly sexy voice, then consider joining my Substack, where I dive even deeper to these riveting topics. And also unrelated to philosophy, we talk about video games and movies and stuff like that. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on the topics from today, you can do so on the Substack as well. It's totally free at the moment. Yeah, please consider liking, subscribing, commenting. What could be better? Comment whatever that is. Comment an emoji. Just do anything. Help me with the algorithm. Links in the description and all that. Thanks so much for watching, guys. And I will see you in the next episode. Ciao.